Hey guys, tonight we're crawling into bed somewhere colder than your landlord's heart. The winter slums of Victorian London. Not the Charles Dickens Christmas card version with the roasted goose and the snow that looks nice in a painting. I mean the real one. The one with ice growing on the inside of the windows, 6 people sharing one mattress for the body heat. And a coal bill that could bankrupt a duke. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here, because begging isn't very Victorian of me. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always 2 AM somewhere, and honestly, that tracks, because in a Victorian slum it was always the coldest hour somewhere in the building too. Now dim the lights. Put on a fan for that soft white noise, unless you'd rather open a window and let actual freezing air in which case respect. You're already halfway to method acting this one. Get comfortable, pull the blanket up, and let's ease into tonight together. Before we go, let me ask you something. Have you ever complained that your apartment thermostat takes too long to kick in? Ever stood in front of an open fridge just to feel the draft and called that suffering? Have you ever worn 2 hoodies indoors and thought you were really enduring something? What do you think people did before central heating, before double glazing, before the humble radiator, when they were also broke, also hungry, and also packed 8 to a room with a stranger coughing 2 feet from their face? Did anyone actually sleep through an entire Victorian winter night without waking up? Or was every single night just a long, shivering negotiation with your own circulation? Could you survive a January in a house where the walls sweat more than you do? Would you last one single night in a shared bed with 3 children, 1 grandmother, and a suspicious smell? Or would you be the one sneaking off to sleep in the coal cellar out of sheer desperation? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in the East End of London. The year is 1861, give or take a decade, because frankly the cold didn't care what year it was. You're lying under everything you own. Your breath is fogging up above your face like a tiny indoor weather system. And somewhere above your head, ice has formed a delicate little pattern on the inside of the glass. Because yes, the inside. Good luck. Let's start with the room itself, because in a Victorian slum, the room is basically your entire universe. You open your eyes in what the landlord generously calls a flat, though flat is doing a tremendous amount of lifting for a space roughly the size of a modern parking spot, shared with your spouse, 4 children, a cousin whose situation is never fully explained, and possibly a lodger paying 2 pence a week to sleep upright in the corner. The walls are doing their best, which isn't saying much. Plaster the colour of old porridge flakes off in sheets and reveals lath strips beneath, and where damp has crept up from the foundations there are dark tide marks climbing toward the ceiling, like the building itself is slowly drowning from the ground up. Whatever wallpaper once covered these walls surrendered, decades ago, curling away in long brown ribbons that nobody has bothered to strip because nobody has anywhere else to be. The floorboards are original, in the sense that they came with the house and have never once been replaced, and they announce every single movement with a groan loud enough to wake the lodger, who was not really asleep anyway, just pretending, the way you do when 6 other people are breathing in the same 8 feet of air. The room has a smell, and you stop noticing it sometime around your second winter here, though a visitor would notice it immediately, the way you'd notice walking into someone else's damp basement. Coal smoke that never quite finds the chimney draft it's aiming for. Wet wool drying by a fire that isn't lit often enough to actually dry anything. The sourish tang of a chamber pot in the corner that won't be emptied until someone's willing to brave the stairs. And underneath it all, the particular must of plaster that's been wet and dried and wet again so many times it's given up trying to be a wall and started being a sort of vertical sponge. A stub of tallow candle sits on the windowsill, because tallow is what you can afford, rendered animal fat that smokes and stinks and gutters, while wax candles, clean burning and nearly odourless, belong to households with rather more furniture than yours. You've heard wax candles smell like nothing at all. You have never once been in a position to confirm this personally. Speaking of the household, let's take a head count, because the parish enumerator certainly tried to, and gave up halfway through. There's you, your spouse, and 4 children, ranging from an infant who cries at a frequency that seems designed to punish you personally, to an eldest who's already old enough to be sent out selling matches before breakfast. There's the cousin, who arrived 8 months ago from somewhere near Norwich, under circumstances nobody discusses, and has simply never left, contributing occasional shillings and an enormous quantity of opinions about how you're raising your children. And there's the lodger, a stranger to whom you rent floor space the way modern people rent out a spare room on a holiday app, except the review would just say, cold, loud, and someone's foot was in my face all night. 1 star. When the census man does come round, once a decade if you're unlucky enough to be home for it, he stands in the doorway with his pencil and his printed schedule and asks how many souls are resident, and you watch him try to reconcile his tidy columns with the actual arithmetic of your life. The lodger who isn't family, the cousin who technically has another address he never uses, the infant who wasn't born when the last form was filled in. Streets like this one, tucked behind Shoreditch or down toward the Old Nickel, routinely return numbers that make poor law statisticians wince. 40 or 50 souls to a single narrow house built a century ago for one family and a couple of servants, and the enumerator writes it all down anyway, because that's the job, and moves on to the next door before the smell fully registers. Beyond your own walls, the building is already stirring in the way that a hive stirs, which is to say everywhere at once and none of it quietly. You can hear the family below through the floorboards, footsteps and a low argument about who finished the last of the coal, and above you someone is dragging a chair, and out on the shared landing there's the particular scrape and clank of the one privy that serves the whole house being used, queued for, and complained about, all in the same 30 seconds. The pump in the courtyard won't be flowing properly until full light, so nobody's washing yet beyond a token splash of water so cold it counts as a moral accomplishment. Later, after you've all gone, the night soil men will have already come and gone in the small hours, the way they always do, carting away what the houses without proper drains can't manage themselves, a job so thoroughly unglamorous that history barely bothered to record what it paid, though you can guess it wasn't much. The morning announces itself the way it always does here, which is to say loudly and without any regard for how little sleep anyone actually got. Somewhere below, a woman is coughing in that particular wet, rattling way that everyone in the building has learned not to comment on out loud, because commenting on it means acknowledging what it probably is. And nobody has the energy for that conversation before breakfast. Church bells drift over from Christchurch, unhurried and vaguely mocking, as if to remind you that somewhere in this city people are waking up to servants bringing tea, rather than to a baby's elbow in their ribs. Out in the court, a costermonger's cartwheel squeals against the cobbles, and somebody is already hawking something in a voice pitched to carry through brick. You notice, as you always do this time of year, that your fingers have gone stiff and slightly swollen overnight, the skin across the knuckles tight and faintly purple, which is simply what chilblains do to a person who spends the cold months without proper gloves and without the coin to warm a room enough to prevent them. Nobody sleeps in a nightgown here, not really, not when nightgowns are a luxury for households with a spare set of clothes to change into. You slept in what you'll wear all day, coat included if the night was bad enough, which means dressing this morning is less a ritual than a formality, a matter of standing up and being roughly already there. Getting up is its own small negotiation, because the one shared blanket has migrated in the night the way blankets always do, ending up wrapped around the cousin like some sort of trophy, while your spouse's feet, which started the night tucked under a coat, are now bare in the temperature of the doorstep. There's a brief wordless tug of war conducted mostly through elbows and pointed sighs. The same argument every single household in this building is having at this exact moment, a sort of dawn chorus of quiet grumbling that passes for community spirit around here. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is bread with a scrape of dripping if yesterday was a good day, or weak tea stretched thin enough that the leaves have technically been used 3 times already, or, on the leaner mornings, simply nothing beyond the promise that something will turn up before dinner. If there's a farthing spare, the eldest might be sent down to the street cellar on the corner for a baked potato, hot enough to warm both hands through and eaten slowly to make the warmth last, which counts, in this household, as natural luxury, the Victorian equivalent of a heated car seat. If you want a modern comparison, imagine your entire extended family, plus a paying stranger, crammed into a studio apartment with no heating, no plumbing, and a landlord who considers the walls optional. Now imagine arguing over the thermostat, except there is no thermostat. There is only a fireplace nobody can afford to light, and a general policy of getting dressed as fast as humanly possible so the cold has less surface area to work with. Picture 2 trying to explain to that studio apartment's downstairs neighbours that yes, you can hear absolutely everything, and no, there's no soundproofing to be had at 4 and 6 a week, and yes, that includes the coughing. This is essentially how 8 people manage to share one room and still somehow never actually see each other, on account of everyone being too busy pretending to be asleep to avoid small talk before sunrise. Eventually you're up, more or less dressed, and standing in the one clear patch of floorboard not currently occupied by a child, a cousin, or a stranger's boots, doing the daily mental arithmetic of how many mouths need feeding and how few pennies exist to feed them. It's not a pleasant sum. It never is. But you do it anyway, every morning, because the alternative is lying back down, and there simply isn't room. Let's talk about the window, if you can even call it that. Somewhere near the corner of the room there's a pane of glass, cracked, patched with brown paper, and this morning it's wearing a delicate coat of frost on the inside, not the outside, the inside, which tells you everything you need to know about how well this building keeps the cold out, and how well it keeps your own breath in. You lean closer, mostly out of morbid curiosity, and watch your breath add fresh crystals to the pattern already spreading across the glass, like something out of a very cheap, very depressing snow globe. This is basic physics, doing something deeply unkind to you. 8 people have been breathing, sweating, and generally existing in this sealed little box all night, and every bit of that warm. Moist air has drifted to the coldest surface in the room and frozen solid the moment it touched it. Nobody in 1860s Whitechapel has heard the word condensation, but everybody who's ever woken up to ice growing sideways across a window pane understands exactly what's happening without needing the vocabulary for it. It's worth pausing on how the pane got cracked in the first place, because it's rarely anything dramatic. Sometimes it's a stray cricket ball from the court below, sometimes it's simply age. Glass in a house like this having been fitted decades ago by a builder working to the cheapest possible standard and never once revisited since. Whatever the cause, replacing it properly would mean calling a glazier, and a glazier costs money that would otherwise buy several days of bread, so the crack gets patched instead, and then patched again when the first patch fails, until the window becomes less a single object than a sort of ongoing argument between glass and paper that paper is slowly, visibly losing. The brown paper patch, applied sometime last winter by your own numb fingers and a pot of flour paste, has done what it can, but paper was never going to compete with an East End February. Where the pane meets the frame, there's a gap you could post a letter through, stuffed with an old rag that's more decorative than functional at this point, and the wind finds it anyway. Threading through in a thin, persistent whistle that's been part of the room's soundtrack for so long, the children don't even notice it anymore. You notice it. You notice it every single night around 3 in the morning when it seems to get personally invested in finding your exposed shoulder. Consider, for a moment, what this window is up against. Outside, London in deep winter is doing its full repertoire. Sooty fog rolling in off the river thick enough to chew. Temperatures plummeting well below freezing. Gutters turning to black ice that will send at least one costermonger's barrow sliding sideways before the morning's out. This is, if you're unlucky, the sort of week the newspapers will later call a London particular. A fog so dense and so laced with coal smoke that it turns noon into dusk and sends half the parish coughing. A fog that doesn't so much roll through the streets as move in and take up residence. And on the other side of this single sheet of cracked glass, held together by paper and stubbornness, is you, your family, and whatever body heat 8 exhausted people can generate under one thin blanket. The window isn't so much a barrier as a suggestion, a polite architectural gesture toward the idea of an indoors. If you're picturing a cheerful little frost fern pattern like something off a greeting card, adjust your expectations. This ice is thick enough to scrape with a fingernail, and by midwinter some households don't bother scraping it at all. Just let it build up in a milky layer that blocks out what little grey daylight London was offering anyway. There's a particular sound to scraping it, a dry, faint screech that the children have turned into a sort of game, seeing who can carve the widest peephole before their fingertip goes numb, which tells you something about how little else there is to do for entertainment on a morning like this one. Wealthier houses a mile west have glass thick enough and fires large enough that this simply never happens to them, and somewhere a builder in Mayfair is being complimented on his draught proofing while your window quietly grows a glacier. It's worth pointing out that this frost isn't even the worst part. The worst part is what happens when it melts. Come midday, if the room warms even slightly, that ice turns to water and runs down the inside of the wall, feeding the same damp patches that are already eating through the plaster, so that your window isn't just failing to keep you warm, it's actively helping the building rot from the inside out. It's a remarkably efficient little cycle of misery for something made of glass and paper. Sanitary reformers touring rookeries like this one for their pamphlets, and reports have a great deal to say about ventilation and the dangers of foul air, and they're not entirely wrong, except that the fresh air they're recommending arrives, in practice, as a knife-edged draught through a gap stuffed with rag, and no family here is choosing between good ventilation and bad. Only between freezing with slightly better air quality or freezing with slightly worse. Some households, if they can spare so much as a farthing for it, will tack up an old sack or a spare bit of sailcloth over the worst of the window come nightfall, sacrificing the last grey scraps of daylight for a slightly less murderous draught, a trade that would strike anyone with central heating as an obviously terrible bargain, and strikes you, most nights, as the only sensible decision available. You've heard that in some of the model dwellings the reformers are so proud of, the ones with proper brick and actual damp courses, the windows barely frost at all, which sounds to you less like architecture and more like folklore, a fairy tale about glass that keeps its promises. So when you scrape a peephole through the frost with your thumbnail to check whether it's snowing yet, understand that you are performing a task your descendants will one day pay quite a lot of money for the privilege of not doing, huddled under duvets in centrally heated flats, complaining about a chilly draught from a window that has never once frozen shut from the inside. They don't know how good they have it. You, on the other hand, know exactly how good you don't. It's time to talk about the bed, or more accurately, the single shared mattress that the entire household has just spent the night arranged across like a very tired, very cold jigsaw puzzle. Personal space is a concept you've heard about the way you've heard about unicorns. The mattress itself, if that word hasn't already stretched past its breaking point today, is a canvas sack stuffed with straw, or flock if you're doing slightly better than your neighbours, or old rags and sawdust if you're doing considerably worse. Years of use have compressed the middle down to almost nothing, so the whole family naturally rolls toward the centre in the night, regardless of where anyone started out, gravity apparently having opinions about efficient heat sharing. There's a reason for that arrangement beyond simple physics, of course. Bodies are the only reliable source of warmth in this room, and everyone learned early that the coldest place to sleep is the edge, so there's a nightly, largely unspoken competition to avoid it that makes musical chairs look like a model of good sportsmanship. The mattress ticking itself has a history, and not a pleasant one. It was filled fresh, once, years ago, and has been topped up since with whatever straw could be had cheaply, which means the bottom layers have long since compacted into something closer to felt than bedding, releasing a faint dusty smell every time somebody shifts their weight. A smell you'd probably describe as a barn if you'd ever actually been inside one. Flock, shredded fragments of old wool and cloth waste bought cheap from the rag trade is considered the better filling, warmer and less prone to shifting, but it costs more to buy in bulk, and buying in bulk is not really a concept available to a household counting farthings, so most people make do with straw and top it up a handful at a time whenever there's a spare penny and a straw merchant nearby. Tonight the arrangement went, roughly, spouse against the wall. 3 of the children stacked in the middle like firewood, the infant tucked against your chest because babies who get cold in this weather sometimes simply don't wake up, and that's a sentence nobody in this room says aloud, but everyone thinks. The eldest child got shuffled toward the outer edge on account of being old enough to complain about it, but not old enough to win the argument, and the cousin has, through some feat of nocturnal manoeuvring nobody witnessed but everyone resents, ended up with the largest share of the blanket. The lodgers sleep separately, technically, in the sense that there is a rope strung across the far corner at chest height that he leans over all night, rather than lying down, a common lodging house trick imported into private rooms by landlords who realised they could charge for sitting space too. Twopence buys you the rope. A penny more, and you might get an actual patch of floor. It's worth knowing that this rope has a name down at the proper lodging houses, the twopenny rope, sometimes called the twopenny hangover, on account of the sleepers slumping forward over it exactly the way it sounds, chin on chest, arms dangling, until the lodging housekeeper comes round at some ungodly hour and simply cuts the rope loose at one end to tip the whole row of them awake at once, which is, when you think about it, a genuinely efficient alarm clock and a genuinely miserable way to greet the day. Your lodger at least gets his own private length of rope, and doesn't have to share the indignity with 11 strangers, which he seems to regard, not unreasonably, as an upgrade. Sleep, such as it is, comes in shallow shifts. Someone always needs to turn over, which requires the coordinated cooperation of at least 3 other sleeping bodies, none of whom appreciate being asked. Someone's foot ends up in someone else's face. The infant cries, gets shushed, cries again, and eventually gets passed around like a very small, very unhappy parcel, until whoever's turn it is manages to settle her back down. And through it all there's the itching, because straw mattresses and shared blankets are prime real estate for fleas and bedbugs, and half the household has developed the specific late-night scratch and sigh combination that passes for a lullaby around here. There's a particular skill, honed over years, in scratching a bite without actually waking yourself further, a sort of drowsy, economical motion that every adult in this room could perform in their sleep, because most nights that's exactly what they're doing. Somewhere in the small hours, ice will crack faintly on the window as the temperature drops another notch, and somebody, half asleep, will haul the blanket a few inches further their own direction without ever quite waking enough to feel guilty about it. And the whole slow tug of war will begin again, a nightly negotiation nobody remembers agreeing to and nobody has the authority to end. If you're doing the modern math, this is roughly 7 people sharing what amounts to a full-size mattress, with no separate blankets, no separate pillows, and no possibility of getting up to sleep on the couch, because there is no couch, there is only more floor. And the floor is colder than the bed by a noticeable margin, Somewhere across town, a gentleman is complaining in his diary about his four-poster bed being slightly draughty, and you would trade every organ you currently possess for even one uninterrupted hour of that particular problem. And yet, brutal as it sounds, this crowding is doing genuine, unglamorous work. 7 bodies under one blanket generate real, measurable heat, in a way that spreading everyone out across separate beds in separate rooms simply couldn't manage without a fire nobody can afford to keep lit. The overcrowding that horrifies sanitary reformers and fills their pamphlets with alarmed exclamation points is, on the coldest nights, the only thing standing between this family and frostbite. Nobody chose this arrangement for comfort. They chose it because the alternative was worse, and around here that's usually how decisions get made. So when morning comes and everyone untangles themselves limb by limb, stiff-necked and faintly resentful, understand that you've just completed a night of communal thermal engineering more sophisticated than anything on a Victorian sanitary inspector's clipboard. It didn't feel like innovation. It felt like someone's elbow in your kidney at 4 a.m, which, technically, is the same thing. There's a knock at the door, and every single person in the room freezes mid-shiver, because that particular knock, 3 sharp raps followed by a pause, belongs to exactly one man, and he's not here to ask how you're keeping warm. The landlord, or more likely his rent collector, since actual landlords in this part of London tend to own the building the way absentee gods own a universe, from a comfortable distance and without much personal involvement, has a schedule, and the schedule does not care that it's the coldest week of the year. Rent is due weekly in a place like this, payable in advance, and the arithmetic never quite works in your favour, because a week's wages from costermongering or dock labour or piecework sewing rarely stretches to cover food, coal and 4 and 6 for the room, especially not this week, when half of it already went to the pawnbroker just to keep everyone fed. It's worth knowing exactly what 4 and 6 actually buys you, since the number on its own doesn't mean much. That's 4 shillings and 6pence, a bit over half of what a fairly steady labouring man might bring home in a good week, and it buys you this one room, no more, no coal included, no water beyond the shared courtyard pump, and certainly no repairs, the landlord's obligations having apparently ended the moment the last coat of paint went on sometime during a previous decade. Multiply that 4 and 6 by every room in the house, and the actual owner of this crumbling building, a man most tenants have never once laid eyes on, is quietly collecting a very tidy income from a property he wouldn't spend 5 minutes standing inside. You do the calculations you've already done a dozen times since Monday, hoping they'll come out differently. They don't. There's a brief, urgent conference conducted entirely in whispers and meaningful looks, the kind of silent domestic negotiation that happens in households everywhere, but here carries the weight of an actual crisis. The cousin suddenly discovers something fascinating on the far side of the room. The eldest child is sent to answer. On the theory, never actually confirmed to work, that landlords are marginally less severe with children than with the adults who technically owe them money. There's also the pawnbroker to think about, since he's already had his share this week, and won't be seeing any more of it back until Friday at the earliest. The 3 brass balls hanging outside his shop are as familiar a landmark round here as the parish church, and half the households on this street have something of theirs currently sitting on his shelves: a Sunday coat, a set of tools, a wedding ring quietly redeemed and repawned so many times it's practically got a season ticket. It's a peculiar sort of banking system, one where the interest rates would make a modern loan shark blush, but it's also, on a week like this one, the only banking system available to anyone in this room, and you've made your peace with it the way you've made your peace with most things lately. The knock comes again, harder. Somewhere in your head you run through the options, and none of them are good. You could ask for more time, and be told, not unkindly but not warmly either, that time isn't really his to give, since he answers to someone else too. You could offer part payment, which sometimes buys a few days, and sometimes buys a very pointed comment about how partial payment is not, strictly speaking, a concept that exists in his ledger. Or you could do what half the court did back in November, which is called shooting the moon, quietly packing up everything you own in the dead of night and vanishing before dawn to another room in another rookery, leaving the debt behind along with usually most of your furniture, because moving fast doesn't leave much time for sentiment. This is essentially a Victorian credit crisis playing out in miniature at your actual front door. Except there's no bank to bail anyone out and no rescheduling of the mortgage, just one man with a ledger and a strong incentive to fill this room with someone who can pay. The eviction, when it comes, doesn't come with much ceremony. Your belongings get put out on the street, the family scatters to find whatever shelter relatives or acquaintances can offer for a night or two, and somewhere in the back of your mind is the casual ward at the workhouse, the last resort nobody wants to think about before they absolutely have to, where you'd trade a night of oakum picking and cold gruel for a roof, no questions asked beyond the ones the workhouse master insists on asking anyway. The workhouse itself looms over every one of these conversations, without ever needing to be named outright. A great grey institutional promise, sitting somewhere at the edge of the parish, ready to take you in on terms designed, quite deliberately by the men who wrote the poor law, to be just bearable enough to survive, and just miserable enough that you'd claw your way back out the first chance. You got. Families who go in together are routinely separated, husbands from wives, parents from children, on the theory that making relief comfortable would only encourage people to want it. Which is the sort of theory that sounds much better on paper in a government office than it does standing on your actual doorstep with the frost coming through the window. Today, mercifully, isn't that day. Today it's an argument through a half-open door, your spouse doing the talking, because negotiating with landlords has apparently become a specialised household skill nobody wanted to develop. Promising the balance by Friday, invoking the cousin's expected wages, invoking anything that sounds plausible enough to buy another 48 hours. The rent collector, who has heard every version of this speech from every room in the building and probably 3 others besides, listens with the weary patience of a man doing this exact routine for the 100th time this week, makes a note in a little book, and warns, without much heat in his voice because he genuinely doesn't need it, that Friday means Friday. The door closes. The room exhales as one organism. Somewhere below you can hear the same conversation, word for word, happening 1 floor down, because misery in a rookery isn't exactly private. It's more of a shared amenity, like the courtyard pump, or the collective sense of dread that arrives every single Monday at roughly the same hour. It's time to deal with the fire, which means it's time to deal with coal, which means it's time to deal with money, which you do not have, at least not enough to keep a fire burning through a night this cold. The math here is almost comically brutal. 100 weight of coal costs more than most households in this building see in disposable income across several days, and it burns down to nothing in a matter of hours if you're actually trying to heat a room, rather than simply admire the concept of warmth from a safe distance. So the fire, when there is one, tends to be a modest, apologetic little thing, fed sparingly, lit late, and allowed to die early, less a hearth in the cosy sense, and more a brief ceremonial gesture toward the idea of not freezing. It helps to understand what coal is actually competing against in your weekly budget, because it isn't just an inconvenience, it's a direct rival to bread. Every penny spent warming the room is a penny not spent feeding the children, and every family on this street has run that calculation more times than they'd like, usually settling on some grim little compromise where the fire gets lit just long enough to boil water for tea and take the worst edge off the air, then dies, and everyone puts on whatever extra layer they own and gets on with being cold. Grates in rooms like yours are small to begin with, built to burn efficiently and not to look impressive, because nobody fitting out a rookery house was thinking about ambience. only about the cheapest possible way of putting a hole in a wall that smoke could escape through, some days more successfully than others. Your first stop, then, isn't the coal merchant at all, not with today's finances, but the costermonger who sells farthing bundles of firewood and cinders out of a barrow at the corner, the same one whose wheel you heard squealing across the cobbles at dawn. A farthing buys you a thin bundle of kindling, chopped from scrap wood and old packing crates tied with string. Enough to get a small blaze going for maybe 20 minutes if you're generous with it, and considerably less if the wood's damp, which, this being London in winter, it usually is. You haggle for it the way you haggle for everything, not because you expect to win much, but because the ritual itself is somehow part of getting through the day. Beyond the firewood there's the coal question proper, and here the options narrow further. Some households send a child around to the gasworks or the railway yards to see if there's coke or cinder going cheap, the leftover byproduct nobody higher up the ladder wants, sold off at a fraction of proper coal prices to people who genuinely cannot be choosy about their fuel. Others simply pick through ash heaps and gutters for unburned lumps that fell off the back of a coal cart, a practice so common it has its own unofficial etiquette among the neighbourhood children who do it. Territorial disputes over particularly promising heaps settled with roughly the seriousness of a small war. There are, in fact, children on this street who can identify the sound of a coal cart's approach from 2 streets away purely by the rattle of its wheels, and who materialise on the corner with a sack and an air of professional interest the moment it turns in, ready to scoop up whatever spills before it hits the gutter properly. A whole informal economy running entirely on other people's carelessness. Charity, such as it is, occasionally intervenes, and a coal club or a benevolent society connected to one of the local churches or a ragged school might, in a particularly hard winter, distribute a small allowance of fuel to families judged sufficiently deserving, a judgment made by committee and dispensed with exactly the mixture of genuine kindness and faint moral scrutiny you'd expect from people who have never once had to choose between coal and bread themselves. You take what's offered and say the required thank yous, because pride is a luxury that, like wax candles, belongs to households with rather more coal than yours. If you do manage to scrape together enough for the coal merchant himself, you're buying by the smallest measure he'll sell, a few pounds at a time rather than a proper sack, which means you're paying, pound for pound, considerably more than a wealthier household buying in bulk would ever dream of paying. This is, in essence, the poverty premium in its purest Victorian form, the grim little rule that being poor makes absolutely everything, including the privilege of not freezing, more expensive per unit than it is for people who can afford to buy in quantity. Somewhere in a well-heeled parlour across town, a full coal scuttle sits by a roaring grate purchased at wholesale rates, and nobody there has ever once calculated the price of warmth down to the farthing, because they've never had to. Back in the room, you build what fire you can with what you've scraped together, coaxing a flame out of damp kindling and a few hoarded lumps, and the whole household gathers around it the way people gather around anything scarce and precious, closer than strictly comfortable, hands out, faces flushed on one side and still numb on the other. The infant gets held closest, naturally, passed hand to hand so everyone gets a turn at the warmest spot without anyone having to say so out loud, and for a few minutes the whole room falls into something almost like contentment, watching a fire that everyone knows is already halfway to dying. It won't last. It never does. But for the 20 or 30 minutes it burns, the room feels almost like a place people could survive in on purpose rather than by accident. And that's about as much optimism as the evening's likely to offer. You'll do this again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until spring finally remembers this part of London exists. Scraping together farthings for firewood the way modern people scroll through energy bills wondering how it got this expensive, except you don't get a bill, you just get colder, and a costermonger who's very glad to see you. Nature calls, and unlike your landlord, it does not accept excuses. getting dressed enough to face the outside air just to relieve yourself is in winter, one of the great under-discussed heroics of the working poor. Your court, that narrow brick canyon between two rows of leaning tenements, has one privy for it. Maybe two, if the landlord was feeling generous sometime around the Napoleonic Wars and never thought about it since. That single wooden shed at the end of the yard, balanced over a brick-lined cesspit, is expected to serve every family stacked into every room of every house facing the court, which by conservative counting is somewhere between 30 and 60 human beings, all of whom, this being winter, are drinking a great deal of weak tea to warm themselves, and therefore all needing that shed at roughly the same time each morning. Before you even get that far, there was the night to survive, and the night has its own arrangements. Nobody in their right mind crosses an icy courtyard at 3 a.m. for the sake of decorum. So a chamber pot lives under most beds, chipped enamel or plain earthenware, doing its quiet duty until first light, at which point it gets carried down and emptied into the very privy you're about to queue for, adding its own modest contribution to the general economy of the pit. There is an etiquette to this, unspoken but universally observed, involving who empties whose pot first, and a great deal of studied not noticing. You step out into air so cold it feels like inhaling a knife, cross the yard where yesterday's puddles have become small treacherous skating rinks, and take your place in the queue behind Mrs. Boggett from the second floor, who is stamping her feet and muttering about her chilblains, and old Mr. Pruitt, who has apparently decided this is also an appropriate venue for a full recap of his opinions on the price of coal. Behind you, a boy from the top floor shifts from foot to foot with the particular urgency of the very young and the very cold. And somewhere a baby is crying in a way that suggests its mother is also standing in this queue, and would very much like to not be. This, incidentally, is the closest thing your court has to a morning newspaper. Everyone gets the gossip, the complaints and the weather report, all delivered live, all before anyone has had a proper cup of tea. When your turn finally comes, you discover that the seat itself, a single plank of wood worn smooth by several thousand previous sufferers, has acquired a fine crust of frost overnight, and that someone, bless them, has left a stick propped by the door specifically for the purpose of breaking the ice off before you sit. This is not a design flourish. This is a mercy performed by strangers. The door itself doesn't lock so much as it hooks, a loop of rope over a nail that has clearly been replaced more than once, and you learn early on to hum or cough loudly on your way in, a small courtesy that spares everyone involved a great deal of embarrassment. There is no paper, not the soft kind anyway. You bring a torn corner of yesterday's newspaper, already read for the news, and then read again for the advertisements, and now finally read one last time in the most literal sense. The smell, mercifully, is somewhat dulled by the cold, which is the one and only favour this weather does you all day. Come the spring thaw it will be considerably less merciful, and the whole court will remember exactly why the cesspit needed emptying. Usually right around the moment the night soil men finally show up with their cart to do it, a job so universally dreaded that men who do it professionally are paid in a manner that suggests even the parish vestry understands what it is asking of them. There is, in fact, a whole quiet economy built around this. The night soil, once carted away, gets sold on to market gardeners outside the city, spread on the fields that grow the very cabbages and turnips that will eventually make their way back into your Sunday pot. The cycle, if you think about it too hard, is almost impressively efficient. Best not to think about it too hard while eating. A government inspector came through a few years back, one of a wave of them poking around courts just like yours with notebooks and grim expressions, counting privies per household and writing stern reports about miasma and drainage that got read aloud in Parliament and then largely filed away. His conclusion, roughly, was that a court of this size sharing a single privy over an open cesspit was a public health catastrophe waiting to happen. which is one way of putting what everyone standing in this queue could have told him for free, breath fogging, feet numb, well before he ever picked up his pen. The parish vestry did eventually agree the cesspit needed emptying more regularly. Whether that agreement translated into it actually happening more regularly is a separate and considerably less certain question, one your nose will answer for you come August. Consider for a moment that a few miles west, in the townhouses of Belgravia, there are people who now have a flushing water closet indoors, a marvel of pipes and cisterns that lets a person relieve themselves without once leaving the building or feeling their extremities go numb. You will not be trying that particular innovation this century. You will be standing in a queue in a courtyard, watching your breath turn to fog, waiting your turn behind a man discussing coal prices, because indoor plumbing is a rumour from a different postcode. It is, if you like a modern comparison, roughly the same energy as a single portable toilet serving an entire festival campsite. Except the festival lasts your whole life and nobody is selling overpriced cider to take the edge off. And when you're finally done and hurrying back across the ice toward whatever meagre warmth your room contains, you'll pass the next person in line, already stamping their feet, already composing their own private thoughts about landlords, weather, and the general injustice of a body that insists on doing this sort of thing in January. There is a strange kind of solidarity in it, actually, this shared and shivering indignity. This small daily reminder that everyone in the court, rich in children or rich in nothing at all, is united each morning by exactly one thing, the burning, universal wish that someone would please fix that door latch. The court's brick shed will still be standing there tonight, and tomorrow morning, and for decades after that, waiting patiently for its next visitor. It has, in its own miserable way, outlasted empires. Breakfast is served, and by served I mean assembled from whatever survived the night without freezing solid or being nibbled by something with more legs than you. There is no toaster warming quietly on a countertop, no kettle boiling itself while you check the time. There is a fire that may or may not still be alive from last night's coals, coaxed back into something resembling heat, with a bit of kindling and a great deal of blowing and hoping. You crouch by the grate doing this before you've done anything else, before you've even properly opened your eyes, because a fire that dies now means a fire that must be built entirely from scratch. And building a fire from scratch on a morning this cold, with fingers this stiff, using matches that cost money and a flint striker that mostly just makes you angry, is not how anyone wants to begin their day. A few surviving embers, coaxed along with a scrap of paper and a sliver of wood shaved thin, are worth more right now than most things you own. Once it catches, the room's single pot goes on to heat water, because a proper kettle is one more expense this household never quite got around to affording. And a pot does the job well enough if you're not in a hurry, which, this being your household, you have learnt not to be. The bread is yesterday's, possibly the day before's, bought deliberately stale from the baker, because stale loaves cost less than fresh ones, and nobody in this room is paying a premium for texture. A standard quartern loaf runs a few pence, more when wheat prices climb, and a family this size goes through one most days, which means bread is, without much competition, the single largest item in the weekly budget, more than coal, more than rent some weeks, a fact that makes the phrase bread and scrape feel less like a quaint expression and more like an entire household economics lecture condensed into 3 words. You cut it thick, because thick slices feel more substantial even when they are not. And you spread it not with butter, which belongs to a different economic bracket entirely, but with dripping, the hardened fat skimmed and saved from whatever joint of meat a wealthier household roasted last week, and which your local shop sells cheap by the penny scoop. It has a faint, meaty savour to it, the ghost of a Sunday roast you did not eat, and on a cold morning it is, genuinely, not nothing. This is bread and scrape, and if you want actual jam or actual butter on it, you save that for Sunday, or for illness, or for never. Some mornings, when even dripping feels like an extravagance, treacle does the job instead, dark and sticky and stretched thin across the crust. Or nothing at all, just the bread on its own, chewed slowly to make it feel like more of a meal than it is. The tea is the real triumph of household economy. You do not buy fresh tea leaves every week, because fresh tea leaves cost money you would rather spend on coal or rent or both. Instead, the same leaves get used again, and again dried out on the hob between pots, stretched thin as they'll go before they surrender all flavour and become essentially warm brown water with aspirations. Some families, when funds run especially short, buy second-hand tea leaves swept up and re-dried from the kitchens of grander households, sold on cheap by servants supplementing their wages. Occasionally padded out with sloe leaves or whatever else the seller could get away with, and there have been enough scandals over the years about what unscrupulous grocers pad their tea with that a cautious household learns to buy from someone they trust. Or at least someone they've never caught out before. You do not ask too many questions about your tea. You simply hold the cup with both hands, letting what little warmth it offers travel up through your frozen fingers, and you are grateful. The teapot itself, more likely a battered tin affair than fine china, gets passed round and refilled with hot water 2 or 3 times over the course of the morning before anyone admits the leaves have finally given up entirely. At which point they get spread out on a saucer to dry by the fire, ready to be pressed into service again tomorrow. Waste not, want not, was never really a proverb in this household so much as a description of the only option available. Sugar, if there is any, goes in sparingly, doled out by whoever holds the household purse with the precision of a bank teller counting notes. Milk, if there is any, is more often the tinned condensed sort, thick and overly sweet, stirred in to make the whole business feel slightly more like a treat and slightly less like survival. Some mornings there is a thin porridge instead of bread. Oatmeal boiled down with water into something the children call breakfast, and the parents privately call skilly, thinner soup than solid food, filling exactly as much stomach as it needs to, and not 1 spoonful more. The children get fed first, or at least get first claim on whatever there is, and the adults quietly make do with whatever remains, an arithmetic of sacrifice performed so routinely nobody in the room even remarks on it anymore. Consider that somewhere across town, in a house with actual window glass that fits its frames, a family is sitting down to eggs, bacon, kippers, toast racks, marmalade, a whole silver service devoted to the serious business of breakfast. Food enough on that table to feed your entire court for 2 days, while the paper is read fresh and folded neatly beside the toast, rather than torn into strips and tucked down someone's shirt for warmth later that afternoon. You are not thinking about that family right now, mostly because you are thinking about how to get feeling back into your fingers before you have to go outside again. But it is worth noting, in the spirit of historical accuracy, that this gap existed, and that nobody in Belgravia was losing sleep over it. You finish your bread and scrape, drink down the last of your tea before it goes properly cold, which takes about 90 seconds in a room this size, and you already know it will not be enough to see you through to midday, not by half. But it is warm, it is something, and it is more than the family 2 doors down managed this particular Tuesday. Breakfast, such as it is, concludes somewhere a church bell strikes the hour, entirely unbothered by any of this. Getting dressed for the day is less an act of style and more an act of structural engineering, because in a Victorian winter you are not choosing an outfit. You are building a wall. Every garment you own, and there are not many, gets pressed into service, one layer over the next, in an order determined not by fashion, but by thermodynamics and stubborn desperation. The room itself is not helping. There is frost on the inside of the window this morning, a thin white lace of it across the glass, and your breath comes out in visible clouds as you strip down to nothing before building yourself back up again. A brief and thoroughly unpleasant window of maximum exposure that everyone in the household has learned to get through as quickly as humanly possible. Nobody lingers over their wardrobe choices in a room this cold. You move fast, you move with purpose, and you save any actual deliberation for later, once feeling has returned to your extremities. It starts with whatever passes for underlinen, likely a shift or shirt that has been washed so many times the fabric has gone thin and soft as tissue, offering roughly the insulating properties of a rumour. Some households swear by a flannel binder wrapped snug around the stomach underneath everything else, on the theory, widely held and confidently repeated by people who have never been asked to prove it, that keeping the belly warm wards off fevers and chills and possibly cholera itself, a piece of folk medicine that costs nothing to believe in and, credit where due, does at least keep that particular strip of you warm, even if it does nothing whatsoever for germs nobody yet properly understands. Over that goes another layer if you have one, and if you don't, this is where the newspaper comes in. Folded flat and tucked against your chest, down your sleeves, between your stockings and your boots, newspaper is free, plentiful, and does a surprisingly respectable job of blocking wind, provided you don't mind the faint rustle every time you move and the occasional smudge of yesterday's headlines transferring onto your skin. You are, in a very literal sense, wearing the news, and there is something almost admirable in a system that lets you finish reading the day's events and then immediately repurpose them as insulation. A form of recycling considerably more elegant than anything your grandchildren's grandchildren will manage with a blue bin. Stockings get darned so many times over that the original wool is really more of a rumour holding together a dense archipelago of mending thread, each hole patched in whatever colour yarn happened to be on hand, so that a single stocking might tell the entire story of a winter in a series of small, mismatched repairs. Boots. If you're lucky enough to own a pair that still qualifies as boots, likely have a split sole patched with a bit of scavenged leather or, failing that, cardboard, which works fine right up until it rains or snows or the ground is at all wet, which in an East End winter is essentially always. You wrap your feet in extra rag before forcing them in, partly for warmth and partly because the boots themselves no longer quite fit, and the rag serves as makeshift padding. For those doing piecework with their hands, gloves are a luxury that interferes with the job itself, so mittens with the fingertips cut away are the compromise, palms and wrists covered, fingers left bare and aching in the cold, because a needle or a glue brush cannot be properly managed through wool. Outer layers are whatever coats, shawls and jackets the household possesses, frequently shared between family members on a rotating basis, depending on who is going outside and who isn't, which leads to a certain amount of morning negotiation over who actually needs the good shawl today. Many of these garments have spent time at the pawnbrokers, redeemed on payday and pledged again the moment the rent comes due. A cycle so routine that some families never actually own their winter coat, so much as rent it from themselves in instalments. The pawnbrokers' 3 brass balls hang over half the shop fronts in the district for a reason, and the rhythm is a familiar one: coat in on Monday, coat out on Saturday, worn proudly to church on Sunday, looking every bit as respectable as anyone else in the pew. Then back to the pawnbroker first thing Monday morning to fund the week ahead. It is, in its way, a kind of rental scheme centuries ahead of its time, minus the app, minus the customer service, plus a shopkeeper who knows your whole family by name and exactly how much your Sunday coat is worth in a pinch. A shawl gets pinned crosswise over the chest and knotted at the back. A technique passed down from mother to daughter with the quiet authority of ancient ritual, because a pin holds better than hope alone. Some parishes run clothing clubs through the local church, a penny a week set aside all year toward a winter coat or a pair of boots come the cold months. A small act of collective forward planning that at least a few families manage to keep up, though a bad summer or a sick child can just as easily wipe out months of careful penny saving in a single afternoon. Consider that this entire process, layering rags and newsprint and darned wool into something resembling armour against the cold, happens every single morning in a room with no heat, by hands already half numb, often by candlelight because the winter sun hasn't bothered showing up yet. Compare that, if you like, to modern advice columns solemnly instructing you to dress in layers for a chilly commute, as though the discovery of putting one jumper over another represents some kind of breakthrough in human ingenuity. Your court figured this out generations ago, using newspaper, safety pins, and pure spite directed at the weather, and did it without the benefit of a single thermal base layer or a moisture wicking anything. By the time you're fully dressed, you are noticeably wider than when you started, padded out like a slightly lumpy scarecrow, every seam and gap stuffed against the draft. It isn't elegant. It will not appear in any fashion plate, but it is, this particular morning, the difference between making it to work and not making it anywhere at all, and so you pull your shawl tight, pin it fast, and step toward the door already bracing for the cold that's waiting to test every single layer you just built. You're out the door now, and London greets you the way it greets everyone in winter, with a fog so thick and so filthy it has its own nickname, and you're about to breathe several lungfuls of it on your walk to work. The pea souper, they call it, on account of its colour, a thick yellow-green murk that rolls in off the river and settles over every street, court. And chimney pot until visibility drops to a few feet and the whole city starts feeling its way forward like it's misplaced its glasses. This is not ordinary mist. This is coal smoke from tens of thousands of chimneys, all burning the cheapest, dirtiest coal available, mixed with river damp and industrial soot and whatever the tanneries and gasworks are contributing that day, all trapped low against the ground by the cold. Somewhere up there, in theory, is the sun, and on a bad day you will not see so much as a suggestion of it, just a faint smudge of paler grey against the general grey, like someone tried to draw daylight from memory and gave up halfway through. It gets into your throat immediately, a scratchy, sulphurous taste that sits at the back of your tongue, and it is not shy about announcing itself in your lungs, which respond with the sort of deep wet cough you'll hear echoing from every direction, a whole city clearing its throat in unison. Blow your nose at the end of a day like this, and the handkerchief comes away, marked in a way that tells you exactly how much of London you've personally been inhaling since breakfast. You pull your shawl up over your nose and mouth, which helps marginally, in the sense that a paper umbrella marginally helps in a thunderstorm. You can't see the far side of the street. You can barely see your own boots. Lampposts materialise out of the murk without warning, and more than one pedestrian this morning will collide with one hard enough to see actual stars, which, ironically, are about the only stars anyone's seeing today. The registrar keeps a quiet tally most winters, and everyone in the district knows, without needing to be told twice, that a really bad stretch of fog leaves more coffins ordered by the end of the month than a clear one does. The very old and the very young paying the steepest price for air the rest of the city is also breathing, but perhaps not quite so constantly outdoors. Here and there a linkman still works the busiest corners, carrying a torch and offering, for a penny, to guide you safely through the worst of the murk to wherever you're going, a trade that sounds almost medieval and yet is doing a brisk business this particular Tuesday, because the fog genuinely does not care what century it is. On the bridges, where the fog gathers thickest over the black water below, ropes are sometimes strung along the railings so pedestrians have something solid to hold on to, because more than one unlucky soul over the years has walked confidently in the wrong direction and found the Thames rather sooner than intended. Underfoot, the snow that fell overnight has already gone from white to a dismal grey-black, soot settling onto it faster than any street sweeper could manage, until walking through it feels less like crossing snow and more like wading through very cold ash. Crossing sweepers, mostly boys, work the busiest intersections with brooms nearly as tall as they are, clearing a path through the muck and slush for anyone willing to toss them a coin, a job that exists purely because the streets are otherwise, quite literally, unwalkable, and on a morning like this one, with fog this thick, the poor lad sweeping the corner is nearly as invisible to oncoming carts as everybody else. which makes the job considerably more dangerous than the penny suggests. Around you, the sounds of the city arrive muffled and disembodied, the clop of a dray horse you can't see, a costermonger somewhere off to your left calling out farthing bundles of firewood, another further off hawking roasted chestnuts from a brazier you can smell before you can see. A distant church bell tolling the hour through air so thick it seems to swallow half the sound before it reaches. You. Everyone moving through this fog develops the same hunched, careful shuffle, one hand out in front like a sleepwalker. Everyone equally blind, equally coughing, equally resigned. And there's an odd companionship in it. Strangers briefly grabbing an elbow to steady one another at a curb neither of them can actually see, then vanishing back into the murk without so much as an exchanged name. You have learned to navigate this fog the way a blind man navigates a familiar room, counting doorways rather than reading signs, feeling for the particular unevenness in the cobbles where your street gives way to the next, trailing a hand along a wall you cannot see but know by heart. Newcomers to the district get hopelessly lost within 100 yards of their own front door on a bad morning, and there is a small, not entirely charitable amusement among the regulars in watching some poor unfortunate turn in a slow, bewildered circle outside a shop they have somehow failed to recognise despite passing it daily for a decade. You yourself were that bewildered figure once, your first winter here, and you try to remember that kindness before you laugh too loudly at the next one. The fog does not discriminate by trade either, though it inconveniences some more spectacularly than others. The costermonger pushing a barrow of vegetables must guess at the curb by feel. The omnibus driver up on his box peers into a wall of yellow-grey nothing and trusts the horses more than his own eyes, and the policeman on his beat walks with one hand trailing the railings, calling out at intervals so that anyone in genuine trouble somewhere in the murk might at least have a voice to aim for. There have been nights, or so you've heard told over the pump, when a constable walked directly past a fallen man 3 times before a groan finally gave the fellow away, the fog swallowing him as thoroughly as if he'd never been there at all. Consider that modern cities occasionally issue an air quality alert and recommend residents stay indoors for a single smoggy afternoon, as though that constitutes hardship. Your entire winter is the air quality alert. Nobody is staying indoors. Everybody has somewhere to be, fog or no fog, lungs or no lungs, and so the whole East End simply puts its head down and walks straight into a cloud that would by any modern measure justify evacuating the borough. You arrive at work with soot in your eyebrows, a cough that will not leave you until March, and the distinct sense that you have just personally negotiated a peace treaty with the atmosphere. The fog does not care. The fog will be back tomorrow, thicker for those who work from home, and in the slums an enormous number of people did. The workday begins hunched over a single candle in a room that is, if anything, colder than the street, because at least the street lets you move around. Here, in a cramped room shared with however many family members the walls can hold, you sit still for hours at a stretch, and stillness in the cold is its own particular punishment. One your feet and fingers will be registering complaints about long before the church bells strike noon. The candle itself, likely tallow rather than the cleaner burning wax the wealthy can afford, gives off a thin, smoky light and a smell like a butcher's shop left too near a fire. But it's what you've got, and you angle your work toward it carefully, because wasting light is wasting money you don't have. A tallow dip costs a fraction of a wax candle, which is precisely why the wealthy burn wax and you don't, and precisely why your room smells faintly of rendered mutton fat well into the evening, a smell that gets into the furniture, the bedding, and eventually, you suspect, your own hair. You buy them a few at a time from the chandler's shop down the street, and you have learned exactly how far one will stretch before it gutters out. Because running out halfway through an evening's work means either sitting in the dark or borrowing from a neighbour who has just as little to spare as you do. If your trade is matchbox making, you're gluing together thin sheets of wood and paper into little trays and cases, one after another, paid not by the hour but by the gross, meaning 1,000 tiny repetitive motions stand between you and a few pennies, and the glue itself, foul-smelling and slow to dry in the cold, seems to actively resent being asked to work in these conditions right along with you. A gross of finished boxes, 144 of them, might earn you a couple of pence, and a fast pair of hands working a full day can just about manage several gross if nothing goes wrong, though something always goes wrong. A batch of wood that splits, a glue pot that's gone too thick and cold to spread properly, a child underfoot who knocks the whole careful stack sideways. You buy your own materials out of that pittance too, wood and paper and paste, so that the money in your hand at the end of the week is really what's left over after the trade has taken its cut twice, once for the work and once for the privilege of being allowed to do it. If your trade is slop work tailoring instead, you're bent over a mountain of half-finished garments sent round by a sweater, the middleman who collects work from a wholesale slop seller and farms it out to home workers like you at whatever rate he feels like offering that week, which is invariably less than the week before. The sweating system, as it has come to be called by the sort of people who write reports about it without ever having to sit through one of these evenings themselves, works by squeezing a little more out of every link in the chain. The wholesaler squeezing the sweater squeezing you, until the actual person doing the actual sewing is left with barely enough to justify the candle, burning down beside her. Buttonholes, seams, hems, endless identical stitches by candlelight, your fingers stiff with cold and pricked more than once, because numb fingers do not reliably know where the needle is anymore, and there is no fingerless mitten clever enough to solve that particular problem, since the whole point of the fingers is that they need to feel the fabric. The thread and materials, insultingly, are often deducted from your pay rather than supplied free, a small administrative cruelty that the trade has apparently agreed to treat as perfectly normal, and heaven help you if a garment comes back from the sweater rejected for uneven stitching, because that means hours of unpaid work redone by the same failing candlelight that caused the trouble in the first place. Your breath fogs faintly even indoors. There's no fire in this room, or if there was one earlier it has long since gone out, because coal costs money, and money is precisely the thing you're sitting here trying to earn one buttonhole at a time. Children old enough to hold a needle or spread glue often work alongside you, not out of any particular cruelty, but out of arithmetic, because a household surviving on piecework needs every pair of hands it can put to use, and childhood, in a room this cold, is a luxury the budget doesn't stretch to cover. A younger one too small to sew usefully might still be set to threading needles or sorting matchsticks by size, small fingers finding uses even before they're old enough for school. And nobody in the room thinks of this as unusual, because it is simply how the rent gets paid this particular winter, the same as it was paid last winter and the winter before that. The hours blur together in a haze of repetitive motion, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the street below, a hawker's cry, a cartwheel catching in a frozen rut, the occasional burst of coughing from the next room that everyone has learned to politely ignore, and now and then the creak of the stairs as another lodger passes on their way to or from whatever work is keeping them equally cold and equally occupied tonight. You work until your eyes ache from the poor light, until your back has forgotten what straight feels like, and at the end of it all a very small pile of finished pieces sits waiting to be counted, weighed and paid for at a rate that will not, when you do the sums later, feel remotely proportionate to the hours just spent producing it. Sunday, at least, offers a slight reprieve, not because the work stops entirely, but because the light is marginally better, and the church bells give the day a shape that the rest of the week, blurred candle to candle, largely lacks. Consider that this arrangement, work delivered to your door, paid strictly by output, no hourly wage, no fixed schedule, deductions taken from materials, has been rediscovered by the modern economy and marketed back to people as flexibility and being your own boss. Your candlelit room got there first, minus the smartphone app, plus the actual smoke inhalation. You blow out what's left of the candle stub when the light fails entirely, rub some feeling back into your hands, and start gathering the day's work to deliver. Already doing the arithmetic on whether tonight's earnings will cover tonight's coal, a sum that, more often than not, refuses to add up in your favour. When the coal runs out and the rent is due on the same unfortunate Tuesday, there's one institution standing between your family and total disaster, and it's got 3 brass balls hanging outside the door. Nobody in the neighbourhood remembers exactly why 3 balls became the universal sign for I will lend you money against your worldly goods and quietly judge you while doing it. Though somebody once told you it traces back to Italian merchant bankers centuries ago, which is a fascinating bit of history you have absolutely no time to appreciate right now, because your husband's Sunday coat needs to. Become tonight's dinner. You know the routine by heart, the way you know the creak of the 3rd stair or the exact spot on the ceiling where the damp comes through worst. The good coat, the one good coat that gets brushed and aired and hung with something like reverence, goes over your arm on Monday morning, wrapped in a bit of old sheet, so the neighbours pretend not to notice what you're carrying. You walk past 3 doors you know almost as well, because half the street does business at Mr. Aldous' shop, and there is no shame in it anymore. Not really. Not when shame is a luxury reserved for people who still have coal. The bell above the door gives its thin little jingle, and the shop swallows you into its particular gloom. That smell of camphor and old wool and brass polish and other people's desperation, shelves stacked to the ceiling with clocks that stopped keeping anyone's time, fenders, fire irons, a fiddle nobody's played in years, wedding rings waiting for husbands who may or may not come back for them. There's a queer sort of dignity in how the shop is arranged, actually, if you stop to notice it, which you rarely do because noticing takes time you don't have. Mr. Aldous keeps a separate little counter, screened off with a curtain, for customers who can't bear to be seen handing over their belongings in front of the general public, and you've used it yourself more than once, on the mornings when pride still had a bit of fight left in it. Whitechapel alone has pawn shops on nearly every 3rd street, Bethnal Green isn't far behind, and Spitalfields has enough of them that the silk weavers, on their very worst weeks, could practically hop from counter to counter without crossing a road, though of course nobody's laughing about it while they're doing it, only afterward, and only to themselves. Mr. Aldous examines the coat the way a surgeon examines a wound, turning back the collar, checking the lining, running a thumb along the buttonholes, and names a price that both of you know is lower than it should be, and higher than you deserve, given how many times he's seen this exact coat this exact month. He writes out your ticket, a little slip of paper that is now the most valuable document in your house, more valuable than any love letter, because without it there is no coat come Saturday. You fold it into your pocket like a promise. This is the pledge, this is the loan, and this is why half the East End refers to sending something to the pawnbroker as putting it up the spout, a phrase so common that children use it before they've the faintest idea what a spout has to do with anything. Parliament, in its infinite and occasionally useful wisdom, has actually set limits on what a man like Mr. Aldous can charge. A halfpenny a month interest on the smallest loans, scaling up for larger sums. All of it written into an act of law that you've never read and never will, though you know its effects intimately every time you count your change. There's a whole hierarchy of pledges too, and you've learned to read it the way a sailor reads clouds. Small, everyday items, boots, tools, the flat iron, get pledged and redeemed within days, practically a weekly subscription to your own possessions. Bigger, dearer items, a watch that was your father's, a set of silver spoons that came down from a grandmother who married slightly above her station, get pledged only in genuine emergency and redeemed with something close to reverence the moment funds allow. Because everyone understands that some things, once truly lost, are lost for good. The coins Mr. Aldous counts into your palm buy coal, buy bread, buy a little paraffin for the lamp, buy you through to Thursday if you're careful, and through to Friday if you're a magician. And here is the great absurd machinery of the whole system. The bit that would make an efficiency expert weep into his ledger. You will walk back into that shop on Saturday. Hand over money you scraped together across the week, plus a bit more for his trouble, and buy back the very same coat you handed him on Monday, purely so you can wear it to church on Sunday and look, for one single hour, like a family that has never pawned anything in its life. Then Monday comes round again, and the coat goes back over your arm, and the whole cycle repeats itself with the tidy regularity of the tides, except the tides don't charge interest, and nobody's ever invented a lunar calendar quite so reliable as a poor family's need for Saturday's 2 extra shillings. It isn't only coats, it's your husband's tools on a bad week, when work's gone slack at the docks or the building sites are frozen solid and nobody's laying bricks in this weather. It's the good blankets, pawned reluctantly and redeemed the moment there's a spare shilling, because a blanket in January is worth more than gold, and everybody in the shop knows it. It's the christening gown, brought in and out of pledge for every child in the family in turn, so that one small scrap of white lace has probably visited Mr. Aldous's shelves more times than the vicar has visited your street. Some families have a standing arrangement so familiar it borders on friendship, if friendship can be built entirely on mutual understanding of exactly how little everything is worth. Should the worst happen and a family simply cannot find the money to redeem something within the year the law allows, the item doesn't vanish, it goes up for auction along with all the other unclaimed pledges, sold off to recoup Mr. Aldous's loan. And there is a strange, quiet ritual some families perform of walking past the shop window on sale day, just to see whether their old kettle or their grandfather's watch has found a new home, the way you might walk past a house you used to live in. Nobody enjoys it, but everybody does it anyway. The same way you can't help checking a wound to see if it still hurts. There is a whole silent etiquette to it too. You never ask a neighbour what she's carrying under her shawl on a Monday morning, because you already know, and she extends you the same courtesy. Children are often sent in their mother's place, not because a child can better afford the walk, but because a child hasn't yet learned to feel the particular sting of the transaction, and Mr. Aldous is generally kind to them, slipping them a penny back now and again, but never quite makes it into the household accounts. The pawnbroker himself becomes a sort of unlikely confessor, hearing more honest accounts of a family's fortunes than the parish priest ever will, because nothing tells the truth about a hard winter quite like watching what disappears from a household one item at a time. First the small things, a watch, a ring, a good pair of boots not currently being worn. Then, if the winter is cruel enough, the tools of the trade that earn the money in the first place, which is rather like eating your own seed corn, except the seed corn has a claim ticket and an interest rate. There's a lesser cousin of the pawn shop too, the dolly shop, unlicensed and technically illegal, tucked down an alley or run out of somebody's front parlour, taking in the sort of worn-out rags and broken odds and ends that Mr. Aldous, respectable tradesman that he is, wouldn't dream of putting on his shelves. You avoid the dolly shop when you can, because the rates there are worse and the company rougher, but on the very grimmest weeks, when even Mr. Aldous shakes his head at what you've brought him, you know exactly which back alley to try next, and so does everyone else on your street, which tells you something rather bleak about how thoroughly this particular map has been drawn into the collective memory of the neighbourhood. So when you hear that a family up the road has redeemed nothing from the pawnbroker in 3 whole weeks, you don't think how thrifty of them. You think, good heavens, however did they manage that? And you say a small prayer that whatever windfall arrived for them might drift a little further down the street before the week is out. In the meantime, your coat sits on Mr. Aldous's shelf between somebody's wedding ring and somebody else's fire irons, patiently waiting for Saturday, which really is the only investment portfolio available to a working family in this part of London, and it pays out in exactly one currency, dignity, rented weekly, redeemable on demand, minus a small administrative charge for the privilege of having owned anything in the first place. By midweek, cooking has become a luxury you can no longer afford, which means it's time to join the queue that forms every evening outside the soup kitchen. A queue that tells you more about the state of the neighbourhood than any newspaper ever could. You arrive with your tin can or your battered jug, the same vessel that does duty for milk, for water, for anything liquid the household requires, because owning a separate pot for every purpose is the sort of extravagance reserved for people who have never had to choose between coal and candles. The queue itself is a kind of parish census, stretching from the door of the mission hall out along the pavement and around the corner, made up of your neighbours. The family from the cellar room 2 doors down, an old dock labourer whose hands shake too badly now for any foreman to hire him, a widow with 3 children clinging to her skirts like they're afraid the wind might take one of them. You've noticed how the queue changes character depending on the hour and the weather, thinning out on the nights when the wind comes straight off the river and cutting deep enough to make even hunger think twice, thickening on the nights after a hard frost has closed the docks or the building sites, throwing a fresh crowd of idle men onto the street with nothing to do but stand in line for something warm. Some evenings you recognise half the faces from the pawnbroker's queue that same morning, which strikes you as a rather efficient use of everybody's day. Queue for cash before noon, queue for soup after dark, and somewhere in between, if you're lucky, an hour or 2 of actual work. Getting into this queue at all is not quite as simple as merely showing up hungry, which would be far too straightforward for Victorian charity to allow. Depending on which kitchen you've walked to tonight, you may need a ticket, handed out earlier in the week by a district visitor, a clergyman, or one of the ladies from the parish relief committee who came round assessing which households were the deserving sort of poor rather than the merely troublesome sort. This assessment generally involves a visit to your room, a glance at how tidily the family is keeping itself despite everything, and a series of gentle but pointed questions about your husband's habits, his sobriety, his church attendance, none of which has the faintest bearing on whether your children are hungry tonight, but all of which apparently has a great deal of bearing on whether the committee considers you worth feeding. Other kitchens, run by bodies like the Ragged School Union or one of the many charitable societies that have sprung up faster than anyone can track them, operate on a simpler principle, first come, first served, which sounds egalitarian until you remember that first come means standing in the cold an hour before the doors open, stamping your feet against the pavement, watching your breath hang in the air like a little ghost of the meal you haven't eaten yet. The Ragged School Union kitchens in particular have a habit of feeding the children first, and, separately, on the theory, not entirely wrong, that a child who's had a hot meal is a child more likely to sit still through the reading lesson that follows. And you've come to rather appreciate this bit of self-interested generosity, since it means your youngest gets fed twice in a good week, once at the school and once at home, an arrangement you're not about to mention to the committee for fear they'll find some way to close the loophole. Not every kitchen is run by ladies of leisure with time on their hands, either. Some of the better organised ones down in Whitechapel and Shoreditch are funded by a rotating collection among local tradesmen. The baker who can't sell yesterday's loaves at full price anyway, the butcher who donates the bones and trimmings that would otherwise go to the knacker, the greengrocer who parts with vegetables just past their prime. All of it boiled down together into something that would make a Parisian chef weep, but that fills a stomach on a night when filling a stomach is the entire ambition of the evening. You've come to think of it as a strange sort of alchemy, watching a kitchen turn other people's leftovers into your family's supper, and you try not to dwell too long on what that says about the arrangement of the world. The smell reaches you before the soup does, drifting out whenever the door opens to let someone through. A thick, warm smell of pearl barley and bones boiled down past the point of dignity, sometimes with a scrap of meat in it if the kitchen's had a good week, sometimes not, but always hot, and heat is very nearly the whole point. You shuffle forward inch by inch, the queue a slow-moving organism of coughs and murmured conversation, and children asking, with the terrible honesty of the very young, whether it's their turn yet. There is no shortage of well-meaning lectures included free of charge with your soup, mind you. Some committees can't resist pairing a bowl of broth with a short sermon on thrift, temperance, or the general moral benefits of not being poor, delivered by someone who has never once had to decide between a scuttle of coal and a loaf of bread. And you nod along and say thank you kindly, because the soup is warm and the sermon, mercifully, is short. By the time you're walking home, can in hand, the street lamps throwing their weak yellow circles onto the frost, you pass others still queuing, still waiting their turn, and you exchange a nod, the particular nod of people who understand exactly what the other is going through, without needing a single word wasted on the subject. Your children will eat tonight because a parish committee decided your family belonged on the deserving side of an entirely arbitrary line, which is either a comforting thought or a deeply unsettling one, depending on how long you let yourself think about it. Best not to think about it too long. The soup's getting cold, and so, as ever, is everything else. You'd think water would be the one thing a Victorian slum has plenty of. What with the fog, the damp, and the rain that never quite stops. But getting a bucket of usable water in the dead of winter is its own small war. The irony is not lost on you. Standing in weather so wet it seems to be raining sideways that the actual business of obtaining a drink requires more strategy than a general planning a siege. Your court shares a single standpipe with perhaps a dozen other households, and that standpipe does not run all day the way water simply appears from a tap in the houses of people who have never had to think about where water comes from. It is turned on by the water company for a set window, sometimes an hour in the morning, sometimes less, and the rest of the day it stands there dry and useless as a monument to a river that used to flow. There are, if you can believe it, several different water companies operating across London, each with its own pipes, its own schedules, and its own notion of what constitutes reasonable service, and which one supplies your court depends entirely on the accident of which pipe happened to be laid down your particular street decades ago. Long before anyone thought to ask the people actually drinking the stuff for an opinion on the matter. Some companies draw their water from stretches of the Thames so far downstream of every sewer outlet in the city that you'd rather not think too hard about the journey it's taken to reach your bucket. And on the days you do think about it, you find yourself boiling that bucket a little more thoroughly than usual, just in case thinking counts for something. In hard frost, even that brief hour becomes a gamble, because the pipe itself can freeze solid overnight, and there is nothing quite like the particular despair of hearing the water finally turned on somewhere down the main, and getting nothing from your own pump but a groan. A shudder, and a spray of ice crystals for your trouble. Someone always has a kettle of hot water on hand for exactly this emergency, poured carefully over the pump handle and the spout to coax it back to life. A ritual performed with the seriousness of a chemist over a delicate experiment, because the alternative is walking 3 streets over to beg the use of somebody else's pump, and that somebody else has their own queue, their own frozen handle, and their own opinions about strangers turning up with buckets at the crack of dawn. And there is without question a queue, forming in the dark while the sky's still the colour of a week-old bruise, women and children mostly, wrapped in every shawl the household owns, stamping their feet not for warmth exactly, but because standing still in this cold for 20 minutes makes your feet forget they belong to you. The etiquette of the queue is taken with a seriousness that would impress a barrister. Everyone knows whose turn is whose, everyone remembers who queue jumped last Tuesday and has not forgotten it, and disputes over buckets have been known to end in language that would make a bargeman blush. You've seen 2 women nearly come to blows over 3 inches of water left in the trough after the pump sputtered dry, and honestly, you understood both sides of the argument completely. The very youngest and oldest of the court have learned to make themselves useful in this operation, despite having no real strength for hauling. A child stationed as lookout to run and fetch the household the moment the pump gives its first cough of life. An old grandmother posted at a window to holler down the news the instant she hears the telltale rattle of the pipes waking up somewhere along. The terrace, because in this business, 5 minutes warning can be the difference between a full bucket and an empty one, and nobody in this court has ever pretended that water is distributed according to need rather than according to who got there first with the biggest pail. Once you've got your water, the day's work has only just begun, because now you must decide what it's actually fit for. Since Dr. Snow traced that dreadful cholera outbreak a few years back to a single contaminated pump down on Broad Street, pulling the very handle off it to stop people drinking from it, there's a nervous new habit up and down these streets of boiling water before anyone trusts it near their mouth, especially with the privies and the drains sitting rather closer to some of these pumps than anybody would. Like to admit in polite company. You boil what you can spare the fuel to boil, which given the price of coal this week is not nearly as much as you'd like. And you either rest with the particular suspicion of someone who has heard enough parish sermons about bad water and worse fevers to take the warning seriously even without entirely understanding the science behind it. There's a fair bit of argument on the street about the whole business too. Some neighbours swearing by boiling everything without exception, others insisting the water from your particular pump has always been sweet enough, and that boiling is a fuss invented by doctors with too much time on their hands. And you notice, without saying anything to anyone, that the households doing the most boiling seem to be the ones burying the fewest children, which strikes you as the sort of evidence a sermon could never quite match for persuasiveness, even if nobody in the court could explain the actual mechanism to you if you held a knife to their throat. Snow itself becomes a resource on the very worst days, when the pipe's frozen through and no amount of kettle pouring will revive it. You send the children out with a pail to gather the cleanest looking drift they can find, well away from the road where the horse traffic has churned everything the colour of gravy, and you melt it over the fire, watching a great mound of white collapse down into a disappointingly small puddle of grey water. Proof that snow is mostly just air with delusions of grandeur. It takes an enormous quantity of the stuff to produce even a modest jug, and the whole family develops a keen, almost professional eye for the difference between fresh clean snow and the sort that's been sitting by the road since Tuesday, absorbing everybody's opinions about it. Ice, too, has its uses once the initial disaster of a frozen pump has been dealt with, and you've seen boys chip long shards off the trough edges and the eaves to suck on like sweets, a pastime that horrifies every mother on the court, and that every mother on the court also secretly remembers doing herself at that age, because a lump of ice, whatever its questionable origins, is at least free, which puts it well ahead of almost everything else currently available to a child in this part of London. There's a rhythm to the whole neighbourhood's relationship with the pump that outsiders never quite grasp, the way it becomes not just a water source, but something closer to a town square, the one spot in the court where every household is more or less guaranteed to cross paths with every other household at least once a day. News travels along that queue faster than any parish notice board. Who's expecting a child, who's behind on rent, whose husband came home from the public house in a state again last night, all of it exchanged in the 20 minutes it takes to fill a bucket, so that the pump serves a second function nobody at the water company ever intended or would likely approve of, keeping the entire street informed of itself, one dripping, half-frozen conversation at a time. Some households give up the fight entirely and pay a water carrier, a fellow with a cart and a barrel who makes his rounds selling water by the bucket to those too old, too busy, or too sensible to stand in a frozen queue at dawn. And you privately think this man has found the one genuinely reliable business in the entire neighbourhood, because everybody, rich or poor, saint or sinner, needs water, and he alone among all the tradesmen on your street never has to worry about demand drying up, even when the pump does. He charges what the market will bear, which in a hard frost is considerably more than what it bears in June. A piece of seasonal pricing that would make a modern airline executive nod in grim professional respect. By the time you've hauled your bucket home, arms aching, hem soaked through with slush, you've spent the better part of an hour securing something that falls, quite literally, from the sky in this city on average about 4 days out of 5. Truly, nothing in this life is free, not even the weather. For some, on the very worst nights, none of the above is even an option, and the last resort waiting at the end of the road has a nickname that sounds almost friendly. It's called the Spike, and it's anything but. You've heard the name whispered among the truly desperate the way other people whisper about the doctor's bill or the debt collector, a word that means you have run entirely out of coats to pawn, soup kitchens to queue at, and neighbours left to ask for one more favour. The Spike is the casual ward of the Poor Law Union workhouse, the section set aside not for the settled paupers who live there permanently, but for the tramps, the vagrants, and the temporarily ruined. Anyone who turns up at the gate after dark with nowhere else in the world to put their head down. The name itself is thought to come from the spike used in the oakum work, though you've also heard it said the word simply describes the iron gate itself. And honestly, nobody on your street much cares which story is true, since either way it's the same grim building at the end of it. You've walked past that gate 100 times without giving it a second thought, the way you'd walk past any building that doesn't concern you. But the first time you actually approach it as a supplicant rather than a passerby, it looks considerably taller than it did from across the road, which you suspect is entirely by design. Getting in is its own small ordeal, because the workhouse porter is under strict instruction not to simply wave in anyone who fancies a warm bed, and you can hardly blame the guardians of the Poor Law Union for being suspicious, given how many people up and down England have discovered that a night in the spike, however grim, still beats a night on a frozen doorstep. You present yourself at the gate, answer the porter's questions about where you've come from and where you're bound, and submit to having your pockets and your bundle searched, because possessing any money at all, even tuppence, can see you turned away on the theory that a man with tuppence can surely afford a lodging house instead. It is a strange sort of poverty test, proving you are poor enough to deserve help by demonstrating you own absolutely nothing, a bar that a distressing number of people manage to clear without difficulty. The porter himself, you notice, has developed an entire private science of reading a person at the gate in under a minute, sizing up a coat, a pair of boots, the particular hollowness of a face, and sorting the genuinely destitute from the merely tired with the confidence of a man who has been doing this job for a very long time and has stopped being surprised by anything. Arrive too late in the evening and you may find the ward already full for the night, its quota of beds claimed, and be turned away regardless of how cold the wind has turned, because the spike, unlike misery itself, does have a ceiling on how much of it any given building is prepared to admit. Once admitted, you're bathed, whether you feel you need it or not, in water that has very often already served several other people that same evening, because heating fresh water for every single arrival would be an extravagance nobody's budgeting for. You're issued a rough nightshirt, and your own clothes are taken away to be fumigated overnight, which is either a genuine kindness given what's likely living in the seams, or a fairly effective way of making sure you can't slip out again before morning, and you privately suspect it's rather a bit of both. Then it's off to the sleeping cell, which might be a narrow room with a shared straw mattress or, in the stricter unions, individual cells with nothing more than a plank bed and perhaps a rug, cold enough that you sleep in every stitch the workhouse has issued you and still lie there rigid with shivering until exhaustion finally wins the argument. Some unions have taken to installing a sort of hammock arrangement of canvas slung between low rails instead of a proper mattress, which the Guardians describe in their reports as a hygienic improvement, and which everyone who has actually slept in one describes rather differently, generally using words unsuitable for a parish report. You lie there listening to the wind test every gap in the brickwork, to the cough of the man in the next cell, to the distant chime of a church clock marking hours that seem to pass with theatrical slowness. And you understand, in a way you never quite appreciated before tonight, that a roof is not the same thing as warmth, whatever the guardians of the Poor Law Union might choose to believe about the matter. The bed and the meal that comes with it, usually bread and a bowl of gruel about as thin and comforting as the winter fog outside, are never given away for nothing, because the whole system runs on the principle that idleness must never be rewarded, even idleness brought on by frostbite and unemployment. Before you're released the next day, you're set a task, and the two great specialties of the casual ward are oakum picking and stone breaking. Oakum picking has you sitting with stiff cold fingers, unpicking old tarred rope fibber by fibre until you've produced your quota, usually around a pound, your hands blackened and raw from rope tar that seems to work its way permanently into every crease of your skin. Stone breaking, where the ward has a yard for it, has you swinging a hammer at a heap of stone through a metal grill until you've reduced your allotted portion to gravel small enough to pass through the bars, which is a fairly bracing way to greet the morning when you've had perhaps 4 hours of frozen, fitful sleep. Women and children, when they end up in the ward, are generally spared the stone yard and set instead to picking oakum indoors or scrubbing the ward's own floors and passages, which the guardians consider a gentler class of labour, though anyone who has scrubbed a stone floor with water gone half to ice by the time it reaches the far corner of the room might reasonably dispute the word gentle. There's a particular grim comedy to the whole arrangement. In fact, a building whose entire purpose is charity, insisting that its recipients pay for that charity in exactly the currency, physical labour, that landed most of them at the gate in the first place, having run short of paying work to begin with. Since the new regulations came in a few years back, you can no longer simply walk out again once your task is done and be on your way by noon, because too many people had turned the spike into a sort of grim hotel chain, working one ward's task and walking straight to the next union's casual ward for a second night's lodging. Now you're generally kept 2 nights, with the second day's labour required before you're let go, which means anyone genuinely searching for work loses an entire day of searching for the privilege of having slept indoors. A piece of bureaucratic logic that manages to solve one problem by quietly creating another. Which is, if you think about it, most of what bureaucratic logic tends to do. The workhouse master presiding over all this runs his ward with the brisk, joyless efficiency of a man who has seen every excuse in the book and stopped being moved by any of them years ago, and you've heard he keeps a particularly beady eye out for the same faces returning too often, since repeat visitors within a month can be made to stay considerably longer or set a heavier task, on the theory that a truly diligent pauper would surely have found permanent lodging by. Now, he keeps a great ledger of names and dates by the gate for exactly this purpose, and you've heard that some of the more resourceful regulars have taken to giving a different name at every union they pass through. A small act of bureaucratic rebellion that the master, to his credit, seems to find more amusing than infuriating, given how thoroughly he's onto the trick. So you take the spike only when there is truly nothing else, when the pawnbroker's shelves are already groaning with everything you own, and the soup kitchen queue has come and gone, and you walk out the far gate the next morning, with tar-stained hands or aching shoulders blinking in the grey daylight, thinking that you have paid for that bed and that bowl of gruel rather more dearly than any hotel in London would ever dare to charge, and at least the hotels don't ask to see your rope-picking references on the way out. Sleep, when it finally comes, is rarely quiet, because somewhere in the room, and usually in several rooms at once, someone is coughing in a way that the whole street has learned to recognise and dread. There's an entire vocabulary of coughs in this neighbourhood, and everyone within earshot has become, whether they wanted the education or not, a reluctant expert in diagnosing through a party wall. There's the ordinary winter cough, the one everybody has, born of coal smoke and damp, and the general insult of an English January, which rattles a bit and clears by February and nobody worries about it overmuch. Then there's the other sort, the deep, tearing, relentless cough that goes on night after night, that doesn't loosen with a hot drink or ease when the sufferer sits up, the one neighbours have started calling, with the grim honesty of people who don't have the luxury of euphemism, the graveyard cough. You've come to sort the sounds of the night the way a farmer sorts weather, without quite meaning to, and without any formal training beyond simply having lived through enough winters in a building where the walls are thin enough to carry every sneeze and murmur from one family's business into another's. The infant's cough that means croup and calls for a steaming kettle held near the cot. The old man's cough downstairs that's been the same for years and will likely go on being the same for years more, a permanent fixture of the building like the crack in the third-floor landing. And underneath it all, the cough you dread hearing start up in a room where it wasn't there last winter, because you know, before the sufferer or their family will admit it even to themselves, roughly what it means and roughly how the next several months are going to go. You know it when you hear it through the wall, because it has a particular rhythm, a pause for breath that seems to take longer each week. And if you've lived on this street any length of time, you know exactly which families have already lost someone to it, and which families are watching the same pattern begin again in a new set of lungs. Consumption is the word the doctor uses when he finally comes, though half the street simply says the wasting, because that's what it does. It wastes a person slowly, month by month, the cough joined eventually by the handkerchief nobody wants to look at too closely, by the fever that flushes the cheeks in a way that almost looks like health if you squint and don't think about it too hard. It moves through crowded rooms the way gossip moves through a market, and crowded rooms are the one thing this neighbourhood has no shortage of. Families of 6 and 7 sharing a single room, breathing the same close air all winter, with the window shut tight against a cold that would otherwise finish the job even faster. There's a particular cruelty to consumption that the whole street understands without anyone needing to explain it. The way it seems to prefer the young, the ones just old enough to be earning a wage and helping the family along, 17, 18, 20 years old, cut down just as they were becoming useful rather than merely dependent, which feels less like an illness and more like a personal grudge on the part of whatever governs these things. You've watched families pour what little spare money exists into a good shawl, a bit of extra meat, anything that might slow the wasting, money that could otherwise have gone toward coal or rent. Because how do you weigh warmth for the whole family against one more month for a daughter everyone already suspects won't see the summer? Bronchitis is the more immediate menace, the one that can carry off an infant or an old man in the space of a single bad week, and in weather like this it seems to visit every second household on the court. It starts, always, as something that sounds almost manageable, a tightness in the chest, a wheeze on the stairs, and then some night, usually the coldest night, it turns, and you hear the coughing change register entirely, become a fight for air rather than a mere irritation of it, and you lie awake listening through the wall, wondering whether you ought to knock and ask if they need anything, knowing perfectly well there is very little anyone can offer beyond company and a warm brick for the feet. The infant mortality figures for a court like yours would make grim reading if anyone here had the leisure to read them, or if the parish bothered to publish them in a form meant for anything other than a Guardian's quarterly report nobody on this street will ever see. You don't need the figures anyway. You know them the way you know the coughs, by the small wooden crosses that seem to multiply in the churchyard every February, by the neighbour 2 doors down who has buried 3 children under the age of 2, and speaks of it now with a flat, terrible calm that took you a long while to understand wasn't coldness, but simple exhaustion. The exhaustion of a grief repeated so often it's had to make room for itself in the ordinary business of getting through a day. The parish doctor, when he's sent for, arrives with a bag of remedies that amount to rather less magic than everyone secretly hopes for, a linctus for the cough, advice about keeping the patient warm and the room ventilated, which is advice roughly as useful as telling a drowning man to try being drier, given that warmth is the one commodity in shortest supply on this entire street. He's not a cruel man, generally, just an overworked one, with more households on his parish list than any single doctor could properly attend in a week, let alone in the depths of a bad winter when half the district seems to be coughing at once. And you've noticed he's taken to writing the same 3 lines of advice in his notebook so often that you suspect he could recite them in his sleep, which, given his hours, he very possibly does. In his absence, and frankly often alongside him, the neighbourhood runs on its own pharmacy of poultices and folk cures passed down like family silver. If family silver smelled quite this strongly of onions, a hot onion poultice bound to the chest, goose grease rubbed in and covered with brown paper, a spoonful of treacle and vinegar for the cough. None of it curing anything in the way a modern chemist's shop might promise, but all of it giving tired hands something useful to do at 3 a.m, besides simply listening and worrying. Which counts for a great deal even when the science behind it wouldn't survive 5 minutes of serious scrutiny. There are grander remedies too, for households that can scrape together the money. A bottle of proprietary cough mixture from the chemist down the road, heavy with syrup, and a dash of something considerably stronger than syrup, which does admittedly help everyone sleep. Sufferer and family alike, though whether it helps the lungs or simply helps everyone stop noticing the lungs for a few hours is a question nobody on this street is equipped to answer, and nobody is in the mood to ask. What makes the nights particularly long is that everyone in the room knows, without anyone saying it aloud, that the cold itself is doing at least half the damage, that a warm dry room and a decent diet would do more for the sufferer than every poultice in the arsenal, and that a warm dry room and a decent diet are precisely the 2 things nobody on this street has been able to secure since October. The damp climbs the walls in patches you could trace with your finger, the single blanket gets pulled tighter around whoever's coughing worst, and everyone else in the bed simply accepts they'll be a little colder tonight, so somebody else might be a little less miserable. A small silent act of family economics that never makes it into any parish report, but happens in 10,000 rooms across this city every single winter night. By morning, if the night has gone well, the cough has eased into something merely exhausting rather than something terrifying, and the household gets up bleary-eyed to face another day of queues and pawn tickets and frozen pumps, with the added weight of having slept, at best, in fragments. If the night has not gone well, the street finds out soon enough, because news like that travels faster than any newspaper boy, and the neighbours do what neighbours here always do, which is turn up with whatever small thing they can spare, a bit of coal, a jug of soup, a few minutes of company, because in a place with so little money to go around, sympathy remains, gallingly, the only currency that never needs to be pawned. You're not actually alone in that bed, and I don't mean your 6 relatives. I mean the other tenants, the ones with considerably more legs, who consider the mattress a permanent address rather than a temporary inconvenience. Bedbugs do not care about your moral character. They do not care that you scrubbed the floor on your hands and knees last Sunday, or that you keep your one good shawl folded neatly on the chair rather than flung on the ground like some households you could mention. They live in the seams of the ticking, in the joints of the bedstead, in the cracks of the wall behind your head, and they come out the moment the candle is blown and the room goes properly dark, which in your case is also the moment the room goes properly cold, so at least the 2 miseries arrive together, and you only have to dread 1 bedtime instead of 2. It is worth knowing, if it's any comfort, that bedbugs have never once respected the class system, whatever the parish visitors might quietly imply about the moral character of infested households. The grandest hotels in the West End have their own bug problems, discreetly managed by professional exterminators who arrive by the tradesman's entrance and never breathe a word of it to the guests. There is an entire trade built around it, men who advertise themselves as bug destroyers to the nobility and gentry, armed with corrosive washes and a great deal of confident salesmanship, and if their methods worked as well as their advertisements claimed, nobody in London would be scratching at all. You cannot afford a bug destroyer. You make do with a candle flame and a prayer, which is, on balance, roughly as effective and considerably cheaper. The mattress itself, if you're lucky enough to have one and not just a heap of rags on the floorboards, is stuffed with straw or with flock, which is a polite word for the shredded leftover scraps of other people's worn-out clothing, pressed together into something that resembles bedding the way a wet newspaper resembles an umbrella. It absorbs damp beautifully. It absorbs damp so beautifully that by February it weighs twice what it did in September, and turning it over to find a drier patch has become a nightly ritual, performed with the same grim determination your grandmother brought to saying her prayers. Somewhere in that straw, generations of the aforementioned extra tenants have raised families of their own, and unlike you, they are thriving in this climate. You have to admire the commitment, even as you scratch yourself raw. A common lodging house down the street does the same trick on a grander, more democratic scale, packing a dozen strangers into a room for fourpence a night, all sharing bedding that has hosted more previous occupants than anyone could possibly count, each one contributing a little something to the collective infestation before moving on. At least in your own room the vermin are, in a sense, family vermin, ones you've come to recognise the bites of. The lodging house offers no such continuity, just an endlessly rotating cast of biting strangers, which somehow feels worse, even though it's arguably the same insects doing the same job. There is a whole domestic science to fighting them, none of it especially effective. All of it performed anyway, because doing something feels better than doing nothing while you lie awake being nibbled at by an invisible committee. You run a candle flame along the joints of the bedstead to scorch out what's hiding there, which works right up until the moment you singe your own eyebrows or set fire to something you'd rather keep. You wash the frame with vinegar, which the woman 2 doors down swears by, though she also swears by a poultice of onion for a bad chest. So take that endorsement as you find it. Some households, braver or more desperate than yours. Try a wash of turpentine or a foul-smelling concoction bought from the chemist that claims to contain corrosive sublimate, a substance that will indeed kill bugs, along with potentially anyone who breathes too much of it in an unventilated room, which describes every room you have ever lived in. You beat the mattress against the wall until the dust rises in a cloud that makes everyone cough, which at least momentarily replaces one form of misery with a different, drier one. None of it drives them out for good, because the lodgers upstairs have their own infestation, and the lodgers below have theirs, and vermin, unlike rent, move freely between floors without ever being asked to pay their share. Lice are the itinerant cousins of the operation, less attached to any one address and considerably more attached to you personally, riding along in hair and seams and the folds of a collar that hasn't seen hot water since the coal was affordable enough to heat any. There are, strictly speaking, 3 varieties working your household simultaneously, the kind that favour the scalp, the kind that favour the seams of clothing worn against the skin day and night without changing, and a third kind polite company doesn't discuss above a whisper, and between the 3 of them there is scarcely an inch of you that goes unvisited by February. Fleas contribute their own percussion section, quick and sharp, favouring ankles and the soft skin behind the knee, and a child scratching in his sleep is such an ordinary nighttime sound in this building that nobody so much as stirs at it anymore, any more than you'd stir at a distant dog barking. You learn to sleep through your own itching the way sailors learn to sleep through the creak of a ship, which is to say imperfectly, and with a great deal of muttering. What makes it bearable, if bearable is even the word, is that everyone in the court is in exactly the same boat, or rather the same infested mattress, so there's no particular shame in it, the way there might be shame in it further west where the parlour-maid changes the sheets weekly and nobody has ever had to share a bed with 3 siblings and an itinerant population of biting strangers. Here it's simply Tuesday. You compare notes with your neighbour the way modern people compare notes on a difficult commute, with weary solidarity rather than surprise, and there is something almost companionable in knowing that behind every wall in the building someone else is lying awake, scratching in the dark right along with you. There is even a rough etiquette to it, a nod exchanged over the washing line that says yes, I know, mine too, without either of you having to say the word out loud. If you want to imagine the scale of it properly, picture an entire apartment building where every single unit has the exact same infestation, spreading merrily through the shared plumbing of the walls. And where the landlord's solution, when appealed to, is to suggest that perhaps you are simply not house-proud enough. He does not live here. He has never lived here. He collects the rent from a much warmer room across town and has strong opinions about the cleanliness of people whose walls he has never personally touched. And it does not occur to him for a moment that a building riddled with damp, cracked plaster and rotten skirting boards was never going to stay bug-free, no matter how devoutly its tenants scrubbed. So you turn the mattress, you pull the thin blanket up to your chin, you accept the itching the way you accept the cold, as a background condition of existence rather than an emergency, and you drift off to sleep, doing the same thing every soul in this building is doing tonight, which is sharing your bed with roommates who never once contributed to the rent, and who, frankly, have better attendance records than most of your neighbours' husbands. Coal, when you can get it at all, doesn't arrive by the sensible sackful. It arrives by the farthing bundle, a transaction so small and so sad it deserves its own segment. A farthing bundle is exactly what it sounds like, a meagre armful of chopped wood, kindling, and the occasional scrap of coal dust pressed together, sold by a costermonger who carries it door to door on a barrow or a battered basket, calling out his wares in a voice hoarse from doing this all day in weather that would make a sensible person stay indoors. You hand over your farthing, one of the smallest coins in circulation, worth roughly a quarter of a penny, and in exchange you receive perhaps 20 minutes of actual warmth once it's fed to the fire. It is, if you do the arithmetic, one of the single worst ways to purchase heat available anywhere in the city, and you purchase it constantly. Because it is also the only way available to someone who does not have the spare shillings for anything larger. The bundle boys themselves, and they are very often boys, some of them younger than your own children, are out on these same streets from first light until well after dark, building their little bundles from offcuts scavenged at timber yards and sawmills, tying them with a bit of string or rag and hawking them for the smallest coin in the realm all day long in weather that numbs fingers within the hour. It is not a trade that makes anyone rich, least of all the boy doing the selling, and there is a particular kind of exhausted, business-like cheerfulness to the way they call out their prices. Because a whining costermonger sells nothing, and a cheerful one at least sells something. Consider, by comparison, the household 3 streets over with the coal cellar, the household that orders by the ton and has it delivered in a great clattering cartload that gets shot down a chute into storage that will last the whole winter without another thought. That family pays less per pound of coal than you do, sometimes dramatically less, because buying in bulk has always rewarded people who already have money, while buying in desperate little dribs and drabs has always punished people who don't. It is the same principle, dressed in Victorian soot, that would later see the poor paying more for a single roll of something than the wealthy pay per unit buying it by the crate. Except at least modern warehouse memberships don't require you to personally haul the goods up 4 flights of stairs in the sleet. There is, in fact, a whole seasonal rhythm to coal pricing that works against you with the precision of a machine built specifically for that purpose. Prices are at their lowest in the height of summer, when the sensible and the solvent lay in their winter stock at a discount, filling cellars that will see them comfortably through to March. You, naturally, cannot spare a summer shilling for a winter problem, however much you understand the logic of it, because summer has its own hungry mouths to feed and its own rent to find. So you arrive at the coal market in December, along with every other household in the East End too poor to have planned ahead, exactly when demand is highest, and prices have crept up accordingly, buying dear what your wealthier neighbours bought cheap 6 months earlier. It is not stupidity, it is simply what poverty does to a calendar. When you can scrape together slightly more than a farthing's worth of ambition, you deal instead with the coal merchant proper, a figure of considerable local importance who sells not by the ton, but by the hundredweight, or even by a fraction of that, a small sack you or one of your older children carries home yourselves, because delivery is a luxury reserved for customers who order in quantities. The merchant considers worth his cart. The genuinely poor buy in penny amounts, hardly enough to cover the bottom of the grate, and the merchant, no villain particularly, just a man running a business in a hard trade, adds a little something to the price for the trouble of measuring out such pitiful portions all day long. Everyone in the transaction is behaving rationally. Everyone in the transaction ends up poorer for it, except perhaps the merchant, who at least gets to go home to a fire that isn't rationed by the farthing. There is a particular sound to a coal delivery in this part of London, a great cascading rattle, as the sacks are emptied, and you have learned to listen for it the way a farmer listens for rain, except this rain falls only on the houses that can afford to summon it, and everyone else simply watches the black dust settle on the cobblestones and makes do. The coal itself, when you finally do get some, is not always what it claims to be. There are merchants who pad out a sack with slack, the useless coal dust and small worthless fragments left over from proper coal, and a customer buying in tiny quantities from an unfamiliar seller is in a poor position to complain about being shortchanged on something that barely burns to begin with. Some households have learned to test a sack by ear as much as by eye, listening for the dull thud of good hard lumps rather than the soft hiss of dust, a skill passed down as carefully as any recipe, because it is every bit as necessary to keeping a family fed and warm. You budget for fuel the way you budget for everything else, which is to say badly, because there is no version of this budget that adds up. Rent first, because the alternative to paying rent is the street, and the street in January is not a negotiating position, it is a death sentence. Food next, because hunger makes the cold worse in ways that are almost impossible to describe to someone who has never gone without both at once. Whatever's left, if anything is left, goes to the grate, and some weeks nothing is left at all, and you burn what you can scavenge instead. Broken furniture nobody needs anymore, or the fallen branches your children collect from the parks if they're bold enough to go that far, or the scraps of packing crate fished out from behind a shop that doesn't need them anymore, or simply nothing, and you sit in the cold and call it saving. There are households who supplement their coal with coke bought cheap from the gasworks, a byproduct of the gas made for street lamps and the homes of people who can afford such things, and it burns hot enough if fed properly, though it stinks in a way that takes some getting used to and leaves its own particular film on everything nearby. You take what you can get. Fuel is fuel, and a household that has learnt to be precious about the smell of what it burns is a household that has not yet been cold enough for long enough. It would be funny, in the way that only genuinely unfair things are funny once enough time has passed, that the wealthy of this city are, at this very moment, warm enough to complain about being slightly too warm near the fire, while you are calculating whether tonight is a night that justifies spending a farthing on 20 minutes of heat. But you don't have the energy for irony tonight. You have the energy for one more small bundle of kindling, purchased from a boy half your size who has been out in this weather considerably longer than you have, and for the very small, very Victorian luxury of a fire that lasts just long enough to fall asleep beside. When the fire is burning low and there's no more fuel to feed it, the cheapest heating solution in the entire house is to send the children to bed the moment the sun goes down, whether they're tired or not. In deep winter, the sun goes down shockingly early, sometimes not long after 4 in the afternoon, which means an 8-year-old in this household may spend more hours of the day horizontal in the dark than upright doing anything resembling living. It sounds cruel described that plainly, and there is a cruelty to it, but it is the cruelty of arithmetic rather than the cruelty of malice. A candle costs money. A body under a blanket costs nothing extra at all, and generates a small amount of its own heat besides, which makes bedtime, in this particular economy, the single most cost-effective activity available to a family trying to survive February. Consider the actual candle economics for a moment, because they explain a great deal about why this household runs on the schedule it does. A tallow candle, the cheap sort made from rendered animal fat rather than the finer, sweeter smelling wax the better off households burn, gutters and smokes, and gives off a dim, greasy light that barely reaches the far corner of the room. And even that costs money your family does not have spare to burn away on children who are, by any reasonable measure, better off asleep than awake in a room this cold anyway. A rushlight, the poorer relation still, made from a reed dipped in fat, burns for perhaps half an hour before it needs replacing, and half an hour of light bought at that price does not go very far when there are stockings to darn and mouths to feed and precious little else to see by. Darkness, by contrast, is entirely free, and a family this stretched has learned to take its bargains where it finds them. There is also, frankly, the matter of space, which nobody likes to mention because it sounds almost as sad as the fuel excuse, but is every bit as true. One room, sometimes two, holds an entire family, and possibly a lodger or two taken in to help make the rent. And there simply is not room for every single person to be up, awake and moving around after dark. Put the children down early, and the remaining adults gain a little breathing room by the fire, a little quiet in which to mend a garment by the last of the light, or simply to sit without three small bodies underfoot. It's not that anyone wants the children out of sight. It's that the room was never built to hold this many people conscious at once, and someone has to lie down first. So you tuck them in while there's still a faint grey light coming through the one window, 3 or 4 to a bed if that's what the household requires. Top to tail, so that everybody's feet end up somewhere near somebody's ear, which is undignified but warm. And warmth wins every argument in this house between October and April. You layer whatever spare clothing exists on top of the thin blanket, coats included, because a coat doesn't stop being useful just because the sun's gone down. Some households press an old shawl or a folded sack under the smallest child, a token defence against the chill rising straight up through the mattress from the floorboards, which in a ground floor room in winter can be nearly as cold as the air itself, coming as it does off bare earth or stone that has not felt sunlight in months. The children complain. Of course they complain, because children the world over have never once gone to bed without registering a formal protest. But the complaints fade quickly into the particular fast, deep sleep of the young and the cold, which is really just the body's sensible decision to stop wasting energy being upset about something and start conserving it instead. You tell them a story if you have the breath for one, something half remembered, embellished a little more each telling, because a story costs nothing and does almost as much good as an extra blanket, distracting a hungry, cold child from being hungry and cold for just long enough to fall asleep. No candle burns for this part. You do it by the memory of the words and by feel, sitting on the edge of the mattress in the dark, your own breath visible in front of you, listening to the small sounds of children settling, a cough here, a shiver working itself out there, until the room goes quiet and you can finally hear the fire hissing its last on the far side of the room. There is a kind of skill involved in judging exactly how early is early enough, because put a child down too soon and you get an hour of restless whining before sleep finally takes hold, which wastes precious patience if nothing else, while wait too long and you've burned an extra half hour of candlelight you couldn't spare in the first place. Mothers in this building have this timing worked out to something close to an art form, gauged by the particular quality of a child's yawning, or the way a small body starts leaning a little too heavily against the wall. And it is a skill that would be entirely wasted on anyone who has never once had to weigh a child's tiredness against the household's fuel supply. It is worth pausing to notice what an efficient little machine this is. In its way, this system of putting the youngest and most vulnerable to bed earliest specifically, because they are the cheapest to warm through sleep rather than through fuel. No thermostat, no timer, no little glowing box you set before you leave the room. Just a very old and very reliable technology called several small bodies sharing one blanket, which modern parents accidentally rediscover every single time the heating bill arrives, and they let the toddler sleep in with them instead of running the furnace all night. Necessity, as it turns out, invented the family bed long before anyone thought to write a magazine article about it, and long before anyone thought to charge a subscription fee for the privilege of learning about it. By the time you yourself lie down, hours later, the children are a warm, breathing huddle at the far end of the mattress, and you slide in gratefully at the edge of that borrowed heat, which is really the only kind of central heating this household has ever known. Tomorrow the sun will come up, the fire will need coaxing back to life from whatever embers survived the night, and the whole small economy of warmth will start again from nothing. Tonight, though, for a few hours at least, the cheapest heater in London is snoring gently under a pile of your own coats, and you would not trade it for all the coal in Newcastle. Even indoors, the air itself is working against you, thick with coal smoke from every hearth in the neighbourhood, all of it hanging low over the rookeries in a yellow-black haze that Londoners had already given an affectionate, terrible nickname, the London Particular, or, if you preferred your descriptions a little more culinary, a pea souper, on account of it being roughly the colour and thickness of a bowl of the stuff, minus any of the nourishment. It rolls in off the river and settles over the whole city like a lid clamped down on a pot, and unlike a normal fog, which is at least honest about being made of water, this one is made largely of coal smoke from tens of thousands of chimneys all burning the cheapest. Dirtiest fuel available at the exact same time, in the exact same freezing weather, for the exact same reason you're burning yours, which is that the alternative is worse. The colours of it, on the worst days, shift with an almost theatrical menace, from a dull brownish grey in the early morning to a thick mustard yellow by midday, deepening towards something closer to black as evening comes on, and every hearth in every house is stoked up at once for the long night ahead. Old hands in the neighbourhood claim they can tell how bad a particular fog will get simply by its colour at first light, the way a sailor reads weather in a sky, and there is probably more truth in that folk wisdom than anyone at the time had the science to properly explain. You can taste it before you can properly see it. A bitter, sulphurous tang at the back of the throat that never quite leaves once winter sets in properly, and on the worst days you can watch it curl in under the door and through the gaps around the window frame as though it has been personally invited, settling over everything in the room in a fine grey film that means nothing in this house is ever quite as clean as it looks in the daylight, assuming there is enough daylight left to check. Step outside on a proper pea souper day, and you may not be able to see your own hand held out in front of your face, let alone the lamp-post you know is standing somewhere just ahead of you, which makes the short walk to the pump or the privy into something genuinely hazardous, an errand undertaken by feel and memory rather than sight, with carts and their drivers navigating the same blind soup, and no particular guarantee that either of you will notice the other in time. Men have been known to walk straight into the river on nights like this, misjudging a familiar street by a few crucial feet, and the newspapers report such drownings with a weary regularity that suggests the city has simply come to expect a certain number of its citizens each winter to be quietly swallowed up by their own weather. There is coughing everywhere, all winter, a constant low chorus running through the building day and night, and you've stopped being able to tell whose cough belongs to whom, because everyone's chest sounds roughly the same by January. A wet, rattling thing that the doctors of the day, when anyone can afford to send for one, will call bronchitis or a chill on the lungs, and that the parish burial registers will later call, with grim regularity, simply the cold weather. The fog makes it worse in a way that's easy to feel even if nobody in this room has the scientific vocabulary to explain exactly why. And they don't need the vocabulary anyway, because the lungs know it perfectly well without being told. The very old and the very young suffer worst of all, and there is a particular dread that settles over a household when a bad fog coincides with a bad cough in a small chest, because everyone here has buried someone whose final illness began with exactly that combination. Your own hearth is contributing its share to the misery hanging outside the window, and there is a certain grim comedy in that. If you're in the mood to find comedy in something this bleak, the fact that the very fire you huddle around for survival is also quietly poisoning the air for the entire street, and every other fire on every other street is doing the exact same thing to you in return. An entire city cheerfully suffocating itself for warmth. A mutual arrangement nobody agreed to and nobody can opt out of. Modern people worry about the carbon footprint of a single flight to the coast. This city, on a bad December evening, produces enough smoke to blot out its own sun by 4 in the afternoon, and calls it Tuesday. Chimneys draw poorly in these buildings besides, cracked or badly built or simply choked with the soot of years, so a fair amount of your own smoke never makes it up and out at all. Drifting back into the room instead to join whatever's seeping in from outside, until the single window, when you can bear to crack it for a breath of something fresher, admits air that is barely an improvement on what's already inside. Washing hung to dry near the fire comes away smelling of smoke rather than soap. Curtains and cloths go grey within weeks, no matter how recently they were new. And the window glass itself, on the rare occasions anyone has the leisure to wipe it, comes away black on the rag, an entire winter's worth of London condensed onto a scrap of cotton. Even the snow, on the rare occasions it falls clean, turns a dirty grey within the hour of touching pavement, so that the one weather event that might have made the city briefly beautiful is denied that dignity too, smothered under the same soot as everything else. You learn to live inside it, the way you learn to live inside the cold, adjusting your lungs and your expectations both, timing your errands for the brief clearer hours when the wind manages to shove the worst of it towards some other unlucky burrow, and trading news along the street about which corners are particularly bad tonight, the way people elsewhere might trade weather reports. Except here the forecast is always some version of thick, yellow, and best avoided if you can help it. Tonight the fog presses close against the window, muffling even the sound of the church bells until they seem to be ringing from somewhere underwater, and you burn what little coal you have anyway, because a slightly worse fog outside has always, in this city, beaten a certain freezing death indoors. Winter in the slums has a grim rhythm to it, and part of that rhythm is the knock that isn't the landlord and isn't a neighbour asking for a match. It's someone telling you that old Mrs. so-and-so upstairs didn't wake up this morning. You receive this news the way you receive most news in this building, with a nod and a tired sort of sorrow rather than shock, because nobody in this weather is entirely surprised by it, and the surprise, if there is any, is only ever in the particular name and never in the fact itself. Winter takes the very old and the very young first, as reliably as the tide, and by February most families in the court have lost somebody to it at some point or another. If not this year then, some year recently enough to remember exactly how it went. The parish registers, if anyone ever troubled to add up the numbers across the whole city, would show a mortality rate every winter that climbs noticeably above what the same streets record in June. A pattern so consistent that anyone keeping records at all could set their almanac by it. Nobody in this room needs a registrar's report to know it, though you know it from the sound of the building itself, the particular hush that seems to settle over a court after each new loss, broken only by the same low coughing that never quite stops from November through to March. There's no undertaker sent for straight away, because an undertaker costs money that essentially nobody here has spare, so the work of the death falls instead to the neighbours, who know it well enough by now to move through it almost without discussion. The women lay her out on the bed she died in, washing her and dressing her as decently as the household's spare linen allows, and someone opens the one window, cold as it is. Because there's an old and stubborn belief that a room should be aired for the departing soul, and also, more practically, because the room is small and the season is what it is, and the cold, grim as it sounds, helps. It is, unspoken but understood by everyone present, the only reliable icebox available to people who cannot afford one. And a body can be kept decently for the day or two it takes to arrange things, precisely because the building is exactly as freezing as it's been complaining about being all winter. Small mercies. Someone is sent to fetch whatever family exists elsewhere in the city, and someone else takes on the quiet, unglamorous task of borrowing a clean sheet from a neighbour 2 doors down whose own linen has held up better than most, because the household's own is threadbare past the point of decency, and even in circumstances this reduced, there remains a fierce insistence on doing the thing properly, on giving the departed whatever small dignities can still be scraped together. Pennies get collected almost instinctively, a few coins pressed into the hand of whoever is organising things, not because anyone was asked, but because everyone in the building understands exactly what is needed, and exactly how little any single family can spare of it alone. Word travels the court within the hour, the way it always does, and by evening there's a version of a wake underway in that same cold room, neighbours filing in and out to pay respects, someone's produced a little gin or beer if funds allow, and there's a strange, warm sort of company in it, despite the cold, because grief here has never been a private affair, the way it's sometimes managed further. West, behind closed curtains with hired mourners and a proper drawing room. Here it's communal by necessity and, honestly, probably better for it. Children are hushed but not sent away entirely, because death is not a stranger to them, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of unkindness. And besides, there's nowhere else in the building to send them. There is, amid the sorrow, a kind of practical talk that would seem shockingly blunt to outsiders, neighbours comparing notes on which undertaker offers the fairest rate for the poorest coffins, which clergyman will read the service without charging extra for a hurried one, whether the ground at the nearest burial ground still has room this season, or whether the family will need to look further. Affield. It sounds unfeeling written down. It is not unfeeling in the room. It is simply what love looks like when love has almost no money to work with. A practical, clear-eyed determination to see this done right, despite everything stacked against doing it right. The real dread, the thing spoken of in low voices near the door, where the children can't quite hear it, is the parish burial, the pauper's grave. A fate nearly everyone in this room has personally seen and nobody wants for their own family. It means no coffin worth the name, no service worth remembering, a shared pit reopened and refilled as needed, and a reputation, unfair as it is, that clings to a family the way the smoke clings to the curtains. It's why the burial clubs exist at all. Those small penny-a-week insurance schemes that families scrape into faithfully, even when scraping into anything at all feels impossible. Because the club is the difference between a modest, respectable funeral with your own name on the parish register in the right column, and the other kind. The kind nobody wants to say out loud. You have paid into yours faithfully, some weeks at genuine cost to the dinner table, and tonight, watching the collection quietly taken up around the room to help Mrs. So-and-so's family cover what the club doesn't stretch to, you understand precisely why. The church bells mark the hours through the night as they always do, indifferent to which particular household is grieving beneath them, and somewhere past midnight the room finally empties out to a handful of the closest neighbours keeping the last of the watch, the cold air still drifting in through that open window, doing its quiet, unglamorous work. You go back to your own room eventually, back to your own fire, burning its last few coals, back to your own children breathing warm and alive under their pile of coats, and you hold on to that fact for a moment the way you'd hold on to anything precious and temporary. Because in this building, in this weather, alive and warm enough to complain about the cold, is, this week, actually rather good news. Just when you think the day can't get any colder, there's a gentle rap at the door and a well-dressed stranger appears, clipboard in hand, ready to assess whether your suffering meets the necessary standard for assistance. She is, in all likelihood, a lady from the Charity Organisation Society, or one of its many cousin institutions, and she has come armed with a genuinely sincere desire to help the poor. Filtered through a system so thorough it could take 3 visits just to determine whether you are allowed to be cold. The society was founded on the belief that indiscriminate almsgiving only encourages idleness, so before a single lump of coal changes hands, someone must first establish, with the rigour of a magistrate, whether your poverty is the respectable kind or the disreputable kind. You did not know poverty came in tears. You are learning. It is worth understanding, in fairness to her, that she believes quite sincerely she is doing you a service, and by the standards of her own upbringing she probably is. She has likely read the Society's literature on the perils of promiscuous charity, on how a coal ticket handed out too freely to the wrong household only teaches that household to expect handouts rather than industry, and she recites this philosophy to herself the way you might recite a prayer, as something so foundational it hardly needs examining. She is not being cruel. She is being thorough, in service of a theory that happens to leave you shivering while she works through her checklist. The questions arrive briskly, and you answer them the way you'd answer a customs officer who might, depending on his mood, confiscate your dignity. Are you in regular employment? Have you always been? Do you attend a place of worship? And if so, which and how often? And can anyone corroborate this? Does your husband drink? And if he does, is it the sort of drinking that ruins a man, or merely the sort every man in the street does on a Saturday? You answer honestly where you can, and diplomatically everywhere else. Because the wrong answer, or even the right answer delivered with insufficient humility, can tip you from deserving into undeserving faster than the room can lose its heat. Which, this being your room, is quite fast indeed. She may also ask, gently but pointedly, whether you have applied to the parish for poor relief, because the Society takes a rather dim view of households drawing on both charitable and public support at once, as though a family freezing on 2 fronts ought to have the decency to pick one kind of destitution and stick to it. There is a whole taxonomy of acceptable and unacceptable combinations of hardship that she carries in her head, refined over dozens of visits just like this one, and you have no way of knowing in advance which combination you happen to represent until she has finished writing it down. She surveys the space while she talks, and you find yourself seeing it through her eyes for the first time in months, the black damp climbing the corner by the window, the single blanket doing the work of 4, the children arranged like firewood for warmth rather than affection. She does not say anything unkind. She writes. The scratching of her pencil is, at this particular moment, the loudest sound competing with the wind finding its way through the gap under the door, and you cannot tell which one is judging you more. There is a peculiar performance required of you throughout all this, a tightrope walk between gratitude and pride that no one ever explains the rules to, but everyone is somehow expected to master. Look too comfortable and you plainly don't need the coal ticket. Look too wretched and you plainly haven't been managing your affairs responsibly, which is its own kind of disqualification. Cry, and you risk seeming manipulative. Don't cry, and you risk seeming unmoved by your own circumstances, which unsettles a visitor who has come expecting a certain quantity of visible suffering to justify her afternoon. You settle for an expression you've been practicing all winter, somewhere between stoic and pitiable, the face of a person who is bearing up admirably under trials she never asked to have graded. Your neighbour 2 doors down, who has been through this same interview more times than she can count, has her own theory about it, delivered in the dry, weary tone of someone who long ago stopped expecting the process to make sense. She says the trick is to let the visitor discover one small, tasteful sign of effort, a mended stocking, a swept hearth. Something that suggests thrift and industry without suggesting comfort, because a household that appears to be managing too well raises the same suspicion as one that appears to have given up entirely. It is advice offered with a completely straight face, because there is nothing remotely funny about needing to stage your own poverty correctly in order to be allowed to survive it. There is a second visitor, sometimes a different sort entirely, a young curate or a Bible woman who calls not to assess but simply to sit with you a while, to read a psalm if you want one, and to leave without so much as glancing at the state of the hearth. And you have come to treasure these visits rather more than the official ones, since nothing is being measured and nothing is at stake beyond the plain fact of another human being choosing, for 20 minutes, to be in the room with you. The society itself would likely disapprove of such unstructured kindness, filed as it is under nothing so official as relief. But you notice it warms you rather more reliably than most of what does come with a form attached. Eventually she closes her notebook, tells you your case will be considered by the committee, and steps back out into the cold you have all been discussing so thoroughly, leaving you exactly as cold as you were 20 minutes ago, only now with paperwork pending. The coal, if it comes at all, will come next week, or the week after, once the committee has cross-referenced your account with the clergyman, the landlord, and possibly the corner shop, all of whom have their own opinions about your character, and none of whom are currently freezing in your kitchen. You bank the fire down another notch, and wait, because in the Victorian East End, warmth is rationed not by supply, but by approval, and approval, as it turns out. Moves a good deal slower than winter. By evening, if you can scrape together a coin or two, there's one building on the street that is reliably, gloriously warm, and it is not your house. It is the Gin Palace on the corner, blazing with gas lamps that turn its mirrors and polished mahogany into something almost cathedral-like against the black street outside, and the moment you push through the door, you understand instantly why half the neighbourhood treats it as a second home. The heat hits you first, thick with the press of other bodies, and the coal fire the publican actually keeps stocked, because unlike your landlord, he has a direct financial incentive in you wanting to stay. Then comes the light, more of it in one gaslit room than you've seen collectively in a month of your own tallow candles, bright enough that for a moment you squint like a mole surfacing in daylight. The gin palaces of this decade have been built almost deliberately as a kind of assault on the senses of anyone who has just come in from a cold dark court, and there is no accident in that. The great plate glass windows, the etched mirrors multiplying every flame in the room a dozen times over, the polished brass fittings that catch and throw the gaslight back at you from every angle, all of it is designed to make the coldest, poorest customer in London feel, for the length of a half pint, like he has stumbled into somewhere grand. Temperance reformers write pamphlets about how cynical this is, how the trade lures the desperate in with borrowed splendour, and they are not entirely wrong. But knowing you are being lured does very little to make the warmth feel any less real once you are inside it. The publican, it must be said, understands his customers better than any charity visitor ever will, mostly because he isn't attempting to sort them into moral categories before pouring the gin. He asks after your chilblains, remembers whose husband is out of work, keeps a rough tally of who's good for credit until Friday, and generally functions as an unlicensed combination of newspaper, town crier, and confessor. If you want to know which family's roof caved in, whose child has the whooping cough, or where the coal cart will be tomorrow, you will learn it here faster than anywhere else in the parish, because information, like heat, rises naturally to wherever people are willing to gather. You are not alone in treating the pub as a heating strategy rather than a vice, whatever the temperance pamphlets might imply about it. Old men who cannot afford their own fires nurse a single half pint for the better part of an evening, purely for the warmth of the room, a practice the publican tolerates with the weary patience of a man running the district's only functioning public library, except everyone's reading material is gossip, and everyone's overdue fine is a round of drinks. Children are sent with jugs to fetch beer for parents who cannot leave a sick relative or a smoking chimney unattended. And even that brief errand through the freezing dark is calculated against the reward of stepping, however briefly, into all that gaslight and noise. The jug trade alone keeps a small army of children moving between pub and tenement all winter long, little figures ducking through the fog with a covered jug held carefully against the cold, and the publican has learned to recognise most of them by sight, filling the order without needing to ask whose household it belongs to. There is a democratic quality to it that the charity committees, for all their good intentions, never quite manage. Nobody at the bar is filling out a form to determine whether you deserve to be warm tonight. Your coin buys you the same fire as everyone else's coin. No character reference required, no clergyman consulted, no notebook produced to record whether your gratitude was appropriately calibrated. It is, in its way, the most honest transaction available to you all winter, and considerably less humiliating than most of the alternatives on offer. Reformers of the day scratch their heads endlessly over why the poor persist in spending scarce pennies at the gin palace instead of saving them, and mostly fail to notice the plain arithmetic sitting right in front of them, that a warm room with company costs less, in the moment, than a cold room without it, and the moment is this time of year. Most of what anyone has the strength left to think about. There is, inevitably, a cost to all this beyond the coin at the bar, and the temperance societies are not wrong that a household can lose a week's rent to a husband who found the gaslight rather too agreeable, rather too often. You've seen it happen on this very street, the coal ticket traded for a round of drinks, the children going without because father discovered that a warm room and good company are considerably easier to return to than a cold one. You don't judge it too harshly, not out loud anyway, because you understand the pull of it better than any pamphlet author ever could. But you also keep half an eye on the clock yourself, and half an eye on your own pennies, because the warmth of the gin palace is real, and so is the debt it can leave behind by Friday. The women of the court have their own version of the same refuge, a jug carried home rather than a glass drunk on the premises, the same warmth purchased in smaller, more portable quantities and consumed by the hearth with the children already down for the night, a small private thaw that costs less in reputation, even if it costs the same in coin. Nobody remarks on it. Everybody understands it. A cold house makes philosophers of no one, and forgives quite a lot in the way of small comforts taken wherever they can be found. Of course, the warmth has a curfew built into it, because eventually the publican calls time, the gas is turned down, and the whole glowing room empties back out into a street that has not gotten any less cold while you were inside forgetting about it. You step out with your ears still ringing from the noise and your face still flushed from the heat, and the night reasserts itself immediately. The way a lecture reasserts itself the moment you leave the one warm classroom in a very cold school. Somewhere behind you the publican is already banking his fire for the handful of regulars who will be back before he's finished sweeping, and you trudge home consoling yourself that at least you got an hour of it, which, by the standards of this particular winter, counts as an evening well spent. Let's talk about the walls themselves, because cold is only half the problem. The other half is wet, and in a Victorian tenement the two arrive as a package deal. Run your hand along the plaster near the window and you will find it cool and faintly slick, the way a cellar wall feels in high summer, except this is your bedroom in the dead of January. The wallpaper, wherever there still is any, has given up its pattern entirely along the seams, curling away from the wall in soft grey blisters that peel back further every time someone slams the front door 2 floors down. Beneath it, in the corners where the light rarely reaches, the black mould has established itself with the quiet confidence of a tenant who has never once been asked to pay rent, and never will be, because unlike you, it does not answer to the landlord. Part of the trouble is baked into the building itself, quite literally, in the cheap bricks and thin mortar used to throw these tenements up as fast and as profitably as possible during the building boom decades earlier, with barely a thought given to whether damp from the ground or from the London air would ever find its way in. There was, at the time these buildings went up, no requirement forcing a builder to include a proper damp course in the foundations, a simple layer that keeps ground moisture from wicking straight up through brick and plaster the way a candlewick draws up wax. And plenty of speculative builders skipped whatever precautions existed anyway, because a tenement built to last 20 years and sold on made just as much profit as one built to last a century. You are living, in a very real sense, inside somebody else's shortcut. The roof is doing its own quiet campaign of sabotage overhead. It was built cheaply, patched more cheaply still, and somewhere above your ceiling a slate has slipped or a seam has opened, so that whenever the weather turns, which in this city is roughly always, water finds its way down through the timbers and announces itself with a drip, then a patch of brown blooming across the plaster. Then eventually a permanent damp stain shaped vaguely like a country you will never visit. You have taken to positioning a bucket beneath the worst of it, and the steady plink of water striking tin has become as much a part of your household's nightly soundscape as the coughing, which, you cannot help but notice, seems to be getting worse in direct proportion to how long that stain has been spreading. Frost adds its own flourish to the misery on the coldest nights, creeping across the inside of the window glass in delicate white ferns that would be lovely to look at if they weren't quite such reliable evidence of exactly how cold your own bedroom air has become. Cold enough that moisture is freezing on the wrong side of the pane entirely. Occasionally the damp on the walls freezes too, a fine crust of ice forming over the worst patches by the small hours, which does at least, in its own bleak way, stop the mould spreading for a night, since even mould apparently has its limits. This is not merely aesthetic misfortune, however much it might look like one. Physicians of the period, when they bother visiting streets like yours at all, have started remarking on the connection between damp housing and the diseases that thrive in it. The rheumatism that settles into joints and never fully leaves, the fevers that seem to take hold fastest in the rooms nearest the leaking roof. There is talk in the medical journals, filtering down only very slowly to the streets that actually need to hear it, of a foul air rising from wet walls and rotting timber that weakens the constitution of anyone forced to breathe it night after night. And whether or not the theory behind it is stated quite correctly by the standards of a later century, the observation itself, that the dampest rooms produce the sickest tenants, turns out to be exactly right. Nobody needs a medical degree to work out that sleeping under a permanently wet ceiling, breathing air thick with mildew, is doing your family no favours. But knowing it, and being able to do anything about it, are, as with most things this winter, two entirely separate problems. The landlord, for his part, remains remarkably unmoved by any of this, chiefly because he does not live here and has no plans to start. He calls on Fridays for the rent with the punctuality of a man who has never once missed a payment collection in his life, and any mention of the roof is met with vague assurances that someone will see to it, a promise that has now outlived 2 winters and shows every sign of outliving a third. You suspect, not without reason, that a bucket is simply cheaper than a roofer, and that as long as the rent keeps arriving, the arithmetic will never tip in your ceiling's favour. Sanitary inspectors do exist, at least on paper, empowered in theory to compel a landlord to make repairs that threaten the health of his tenants. But they are few, their districts vast, and a single overworked inspector covering half the East End has considerably more urgent fires to put out than one more leaking roof in one more building exactly like every other building on the street. So you live with it, the way you live with most things this season, by making small adjustments and lowering your expectations accordingly. You move the bed away from the worst corner. You scrape the mould back with a rag every few days, knowing it will return before the week is out, patient and unbothered. The one resident of this building that never seems to feel the cold at all. Despite everything, despite the cold and the coughing and the landlord and the rats, there's one night a year when the whole street seems to collectively decide that misery can wait until tomorrow, and that night is New Year's Eve. It begins, as these things often do, with a great deal of standing around in the freezing dark, waiting for something to happen. Except tonight, nobody minds the waiting nearly as much. Doors that have stayed shut against the wind all winter are propped open just enough to let voices spill out. And neighbours who have spent months nodding grimly at each other over shared miseries now find reasons to linger on the pavement, stamping their feet less from cold than from a kind of restless anticipation. Somewhere a fiddle starts up, badly tuned and entirely unbothered by that fact. And somewhere else a bottle is being passed with a generosity nobody's budget can really justify, that nobody's spirit is willing to argue with tonight. The women of the court have spent the last of the week's pennies on something a little better than the usual fare. A bit of dripping to fry with, perhaps a currant loaf if the budget stretched that far. Because whatever else this year has taken from the household, nobody intends to let the new one arrive on an entirely empty table. Children who have gone to bed at dusk for the better part of 3 months are, tonight, allowed to stay up scandalously late, and they wear that privilege the way other children might wear a new coat. With enormous pride and a certain amount of showing off to the younger ones who still have to go down at the usual hour. Many of you will make your way to a watch night service before the hour turns, packing into a church that is, for once, almost as crowded and nearly as warm as the Gin Palace, full of the mingled smell of damp wool coats and candle wax, and the particular hush that settles over a room full of people determined to see the old year out properly. The vicar prays through the final minutes of the year with one eye on the clock, and the congregation waits with the collective patience of people who have done a great deal of waiting already this winter, and are, for once, waiting for something good. Then the bells go, all across the East End at once, church after church picking up the peal until the whole freezing sky seems to be ringing with it, and the street outside erupts into noise, shouting and singing and the clatter of pans banged together by children who have been allowed, for one single night, to stay up and make as much racket as they like. Strangers shake hands. Old grudges get a temporary amnesty. Someone's uncle, 3 drinks past sensible, insists on singing the same verse of the same song 4 times running, and nobody has the heart, or frankly the sobriety, to stop him. Even the landlord's rent collector, if you happen to pass him in the street tonight, offers a nod and a mumbled good wishes for the year ahead, rather than his usual pointed inquiry about Friday, which strikes you as either a genuine softening or simply a man who has had 1 drink too many himself to remember what day it is, and either way you'll take it. The pawnbroker's shutters are down for once, dark and silent, and there is something almost eerie about walking past that particular doorway without the familiar bell above it ringing. A small, strange gift of a night when even the machinery of your own poverty seems to have paused for breath. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a circle forms and hands link for the old song about old acquaintance not being forgotten, sung with considerably more enthusiasm than tunefulness, and it hardly matters that half the singers cannot remember the second verse, because the first verse repeated twice is, by unspoken agreement, close enough for a street that has more pressing things to worry about than accuracy. Then comes the first footing, the old superstition insisting that the first person to cross your threshold in the new year should be a dark-haired man, ideally bearing a lump of coal, a bit of bread, and a coin, to ensure the household wants for nothing in the year ahead, which, given the household's current inventory, is doing an enormous amount of symbolic heavy lifting on behalf of one small piece of coal. Fair-haired neighbours take good-natured ribbing for their unlucky complexion at this time of year, barred cheerfully from doorsteps up and down the street, while every dark-haired boy in the court suddenly finds himself in tremendous demand, ferried from house to house to deliver luck to as many households as will have him before the night is through, collecting a cheerful string of thank yous and the occasional farthing for his trouble. You laugh about it even as you take it seriously, sending a suitably dark-haired neighbour's boy out the back door and back in the front. Because in a winter this hard, you will take your luck anywhere superstition is willing to offer it, no questions asked, no committee required. For a few hours, nobody is checking whose gratitude was properly calibrated or whose case is still pending review. The cold hasn't gone anywhere, your breath still fogs in the night air, and the roof is still leaking exactly as much as it was yesterday. But for one night, the street belongs to you and your neighbours rather than to the landlord or the almoner or the weather. And that, this deep into winter, counts as about as close to riches as any of you are likely to get. By late January, the whole neighbourhood has settled into a kind of grim communal endurance, a shared understanding that spring is coming eventually. It just isn't coming today, and possibly not tomorrow either. The coal is running low again, as it always is by now, and the ration you eke out each evening has shrunk to the point where the fire produces more symbolism than actual heat. A small orange reminder that warmth exists somewhere in the world, even if it has largely stopped visiting your grate. The days have technically begun lengthening since the solstice, a fact you know intellectually and disbelieve entirely on the evidence of your own frozen fingers. Because 4 more minutes of grey daylight smeared across a sky the colour of dishwater does not feel like meaningful progress to anyone standing in a queue for it. You have, by this point in the season, developed an entire private almanac of small domestic signs that mean absolutely nothing to science and everything to morale. The particular way the ice on the water bucket cracks when you break it each morning, thinner some days than others, gets red like tea leaves. The number of hours the single candle stub needs to last before bed gets counted and compared against last week's stub. And a stub that lasts 5 extra minutes feels, however irrationally, like a personal victory over the season itself. None of it changes the actual temperature by a single degree. All of it helps, in the way that's small. Harmless superstitions have always helped people get through stretches of time too long and too hard to face all at once. Everyone develops their own private weather service this time of year, squinting at the sky each morning for the smallest scrap of evidence that the season is turning. Is that a bit of blue behind the smoke? Did the puddle by the pump take slightly longer to freeze over last night than the night before? The chestnut sellers, God bless their optimism, keep braziers going on the corners regardless, and the smell of roasting chestnuts drifting through the smoke and fog becomes one of the few genuine pleasures available. A brief, fragrant argument against despair that costs a halfpenny and is, frankly, worth every last farthing of it. Even the market stalls seem to sense the shift coming before the weather quite commits to it. The first tentative bundles of forced rhubarb or early greens appearing at the greengrocer's barrow, weeks before anyone would call it truly spring, small, hopeful, overpriced things that most households in the court can only afford to look at rather than buy, but that are somehow worth the looking anyway, a reminder that the earth, somewhere outside this particular fog, has not entirely given up on the idea of growing things again. The coughing that started back in November hasn't really stopped in most households. It has simply become background noise, the way the dripping ceiling or the creak of the stairs has become background noise, absorbed into the general texture of a winter that has overstayed its welcome by several months, and shows no particular inclination to apologise for it. You've grown almost fond of certain miseries out of sheer familiarity, the way you might grow fond of a difficult relative you nonetheless recognise on sight. The frost patterns on the inside of the window, at least, have become genuinely beautiful, which is either a testament to human adaptability or a sign that your standards have quietly relocated somewhere far more modest than they used to be. There is comfort, oddly enough, in doing all this waiting together. Every household on the street is rationing the same shrinking coal pile, eyeing the same stubborn grey sky, trading the same rumours about whether the thaw might arrive early this year the way it apparently did once, decades ago, according to someone's grandmother, who may or may not be reliable on the subject. Misery shared this thoroughly starts to feel less like misery, and more like a kind of collective project, one everybody on the street is quietly, doggedly working on together, one freezing morning at a time. You have survived this same weight every year of your life, and every year of your parents' lives before that, and there is something almost steadying in belonging to a chain of people that long, all of whom made it through to the other side of exactly this kind of morning. And somewhere underneath all the grumbling and the shivering and the counting of days, there is a stubborn, unglamorous kind of hope that keeps you going, the plain certainty that however long this particular winter insists on dragging itself out, it has never yet failed to end. The ice on the pump will crack. The chestnut brazier will eventually give way to a barrow of early violets. The fire will need less coaxing, the coughing will finally start to fade, and the whole grey, huddled street will slowly unclench itself into spring, the way it always has, the way it always somehow will again. So that is where we leave you tonight, wrapped in every rag you own, warmed by a fire the size of a farthing and the sheer stubbornness of the people around you, waiting, as this whole neighbourhood always has, for morning. Let's take a moment now to step back and look at the whole picture. You have spent tonight as a Victorian slum dweller, and if there's one thing you have learned, it's that surviving a London winter with no money was not a single skill but an entire curriculum. Pawnbroking, poultice making, fire rationing, queue etiquette, and the delicate art of sharing one bed with 6 other bodies without losing your temper or your toes. It was miserable, it was absurd, and somehow, night after night, it worked, because the people living it were resourceful in ways that no thermostat has ever had to be. They stuffed newspaper into their coats, turned their children into the family's central heating, argued their way past landlords, and still, somehow, found room for a fiddle and a song on New Year's Eve. None of it was glamorous, none of it was fair. The coal always ran out before the cold did, the charity always came with a clipboard attached, and the fog never once apologised for what it was doing to everyone's lungs. But under every one of those freezing roofs was a kind of stubborn, unspectacular heroism, the sort that doesn't get statues, just another cold morning survived, and then another, and then, eventually spring. These were not people waiting to be rescued. They were people who rescued each other. One shared blanket, one soup queue, one wake attended in a freezing room at a time. So tonight, as you lie in your own warm bed, in a room that holds its heat without a single farthing bundle or a stolen coal chunk, let yourself feel just a little grateful. Grateful for the radiator humming quietly somewhere in the house. Grateful for the window that doesn't grow ice on the inside. Grateful that nobody is going to knock on your door tomorrow with a clipboard to judge whether your suffering has been sufficiently respectable. The Victorian slum dwellers didn't get any of that, and they made it through anyway, stubborn and shivering and somehow, impossibly, still laughing. Let their resilience be the last thing on your mind as your own eyes grow heavy. The fire is banked, the frost is on someone else's window tonight, not yours, and there is nothing left to do now but rest. Sleep well.